Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales. Chapter 57-18. Thunderbolt Whirlpool. Kong Shinmu released his black dragon scales. Coupled with the power of the supreme dark steel, he forcefully resisted the tearing force of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool and entered it. Because the power in the center of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool was too concentrated, it formed a narrow space that was not enclosed. However, this narrow space was not safe. Instead, he would be oppressed by the various forces of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool and even by external forces. With the power of the supreme dark steel, the tearing force of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool could not cause any harm to Kong Shinmu. He could even see the corpses of the cultivators that had been sucked in, accompanied by the pungent smell of blood. How strong was the power of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool? The corpses that had been thrown into this space were quickly crushed. In just a few short breaths, other cultivators were sucked in. Kong Shinmu watched as the cultivators that were sucked in instantly disappeared into the surrounding space. The area next to this space was close to the center of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool. According to common sense, this was also the place where the tearing force of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool was the strongest. The center of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool would superimpose the surrounding forces. As the speed of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool increased and as time passed, the pressure in the empty space at the center would only become stronger. The reason why Kong Shinmu took the risk to enter the Thunderbolt Whirlpool was to absorb its power. As one of the secret techniques of Everlasting Pavilion's Guyangfeng, the Thunderbolt Whirlpool had the ability to devour. Kong Shinmu also had the ability to devour. If he could obtain the power of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool, then his ability to devour could become a secret technique like the Thunderbolt Whirlpool. Just as he was thinking about how to absorb the power of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool, Kong Shinmu realized that the space around him had suddenly increased. Kong Shinmu was keenly aware of the reason for the sudden increase in space. There was one more Thunderbolt Whirlpool. In other words, Guyangfeng had created a mirror Thunderbolt Whirlpool. The two Thunderbolt Whirlpools were opposite each other, but the power they produced was surprisingly the same. With the appearance of the mirror Thunderbolt Whirlpool, more and more cultivators and other things were sucked in. This time, before these cultivators could even get close to the center, they were all smashed to smithereens. The cultivators who were sucked in were mostly at the third or fourth level of supreme divine power. So far, there were no cultivators at the fifth level. In other words, the suction force of Guyangfeng's Thunder Whirlpool could only devour cultivators who were below divine power level 5. If he wanted to absorb more powerful cultivators with supreme divine power, he would need to use a corresponding spell technique to lock onto them. Just now, Guyangfeng had used a spell to lock on him and Emoya. Kong Shinmu had no idea what kind of spell Guyangfeng had cast. He only had one thought in his mind, and that was to devour the thunder vortex. Even if there were two lightning vortexes, Kong Shinmu still wanted to devour them. Kong Shinmu ignored the cultivators and other things that the lightning whirlpool sucked in from the outside world. As long as Emoya was safe, nothing else mattered. Kong Shinmu focused his mind and released his devouring power. The moment the devouring power was released, it began to devour. Kong Shinmu was now in the center of the thunder vortex. After the devouring power was released, it first devoured the power in the center of the thunder vortex. After devouring, the power of the thunder vortex began to disintegrate. After a few breaths, Guyangfeng noticed that there was something wrong with the power of the thunder vortex. Humph, it's just an ant struggling before death. Guyangfeng immediately guessed that it was Kong Shinmu's trick. Guyangfeng had expected that Kong Shinmu would not be devoured by the thunder vortex. After all, if he was swallowed by the thunder vortex, then Kong Shinmu would be too weak. Such a weakling was not worthy of being Feng Er's opponent. The fact that Kong Shinmu could persist in the thunder vortex for so long showed that he had some skills. However, it was a fool's dream to think that he could survive in his thunder vortex. Guyangfeng's hand gestures changed a few times, and the spinning speed of the thunder vortex suddenly increased. At the same time, several streams of black aura condensed around him and headed straight for the thunder vortex. This black aura was Guyangfeng's supreme divine power. It was the supreme fog power. However, due to the thunderbolt whirlpool of his secret technique, his innate talent had undergone a certain change during the cultivation process. Over time, the color of Guyangfeng's talent, fog power, turned black. Later on, when his cultivation base reached the supreme superior level, the supreme mist turned black. Several streams of supreme fog power condensed into the shape of lightning and rushed toward the thunder vortex. Kang Xinmu, who was in the center of the thunder vortex, had already sensed Guyangfeng's arrival the moment he released the supreme fog power. As far as Kang Xinmu was concerned, Guyangfeng's supreme fog power was at the peak of the 8th level. As long as it was still at the 8th level, he was still far from the gate of law. Without the power of law, Guyangfeng was not that difficult to deal with. Kang Xinmu skillfully used the supreme soul power and continued to release his devouring power to devour the thunder vortex. At the same time, Kang Xinmu released the supreme divine flame power to contend with Guyangfeng's supreme fog power. The supreme fog power and Kang Xinmu's supreme divine flame power were exactly the opposite. Although they were both in the 8th level, the moment Kang Xinmu released the supreme divine flame power, he also released the supreme divine flame domain. In a breath's time, the supreme divine flame domain had already spread out with Kang Xinmu as the center. Soon, the supreme divine flame domain covered the entire thunder vortex. The moment the supreme divine flame domain covered the entire thunder vortex, it seemed to have reached the boundary and could no longer spread out. Kang Xinmu gathered his soul consciousness and once again released the supreme divine flame domain. This time, the supreme divine flame domain exceeded the range of the thunder vortex. However, no matter what, it could not spread to the range of the thunder vortex. While Kang Xinmu was puzzled, Guyangfeng's expression changed greatly. He discovered that his thunder vortex was actually out of control. What was worse was that there was an extremely powerful devouring power that was currently devouring the thunder vortex. In a moment of desperation, Guyangfeng also released the supreme divine flame domain. Although his movements were fast, he was still a step too slow. After Kang Xinmu's supreme divine flame domain was released with the help of his soul consciousness, it meant that the devouring power had devoured the thunder vortex. When the devouring power had first devoured the thunder vortex had tried to devour the devouring power. Now that the devouring power had been tempered by the 7 devouring demons' sealing art, its strength was incomparable to before. When the thunder vortex began to devour, the devouring power had already shrunk along with the thunder vortex. By the time the thunder vortex retracted, the devouring power had already completely devoured the thunder vortex. After absorbing the power of the thunder vortex, Kang Xinmu clearly felt that the devouring power had undergone a qualitative change. Kang Xinmu circulated his own power and released his thunder vortex. Chapter 57:19. The moment Kang Xinmu released the thunder whirlpool, Guyangfeng sensed its existence. However, the conceited Guyangfeng did not believe that Kang Xinmu could release the thunder whirlpool. Moreover, the thunder whirlpool was the secret technique of the everlasting pavilion's elder. The successors before him had long since wandered the world, and it had already been several hundred years, perhaps even over 1,000 years since there had been any news of them. It could be said that he was the only one who possessed the thunder whirlpool's secret technique. Guyangfeng controlled his supreme divine power and condensed another thunder whirlpool. This was Guyangfeng's limit. Guyangfeng could release 3 thunder whirlpools at the same time. In other words, on the basis of the 2 mirror thunder whirlpools, he added an outer thunder whirlpool. From the outside, the 3rd thunder whirlpool wrapped around the mirror thunder whirlpool. The moment he released the 3rd thunder whirlpool, Guyangfeng instantly noticed that something was wrong. In the mirror thunder whirlpool, the power in the center of the thunder whirlpool was disintegrating. Even with the addition of his supreme divine power, the power in the thunder whirlpool was still rapidly disintegrating. Not long after, the front thunder whirlpool completely disappeared. No, it didn't disappear. It was still there. Guyangfeng could still see the thunder whirlpool in front of him, but he could not feel the connection. Only then did he realize that the thunder whirlpool in front of him was the one released by Kang Xinmu. "Kid, why do you have the thunder whirlpool secret technique?" This was the point that Guyangfeng could not understand at this time. Kang Xinmu, this kid, was a nobody. This secret technique of yours needs to be strengthened. After Kang Xinmu devoured the thunder whirlpool, he discovered the hidden dangers of the thunder whirlpool during the process of releasing it. If he released the thunder whirlpool according to Guyangfeng's method, the biggest drawback would be the center of the thunder whirlpool. If he encountered a stronger cultivator, he could cast a spell in the center of the thunder whirlpool and disintegrate it. Or he could use his supreme divine power to control the thunder whirlpool to achieve the purpose of reverse rotation. In this way, the thunder whirlpool would concentrate all the power in the periphery and rush to the caster. Kang Xinmu had just thought of this and missed a good opportunity. Fortunately, there were two other lightning whirlpools. Kang Xinmu did whatever he thought of. After absorbing the lightning vortex, Kang Xinmu's figure appeared in Guyangfeng's field of vision. However, before Guyangfeng could further control Kang Xinmu leaped into the opposite side of the mirror image. As soon as he entered, he did as he had planned. It was not difficult to control the lightning whirlpool. Just by relying on the supreme power of the soul, he could achieve his goal of control. Although his supreme soul power hadn't improved much since he had obtained it, it wasn't weak either. It remained at the 5th floor. Supreme soul power was different from other supreme divine powers. It was a supreme divine power that was closely related to one's soul and consciousness. With the power of the 5th level of the supreme soul and Kang Xinmu's current soul consciousness, he easily controlled the lightning whirlpool on the other side of the mirror image. Then, he cast a spell and reversed the flow of the lightning vortex. As expected, all the power in the center of the lightning vortex surged toward the periphery. The speed of the lightning vortex's rotation was proportional to the strength of the caster's spell. Kang Xinmu cast the spell, causing the lightning vortex's speed to reach an unprecedented height. Guyangfeng saw that the lightning vortex on the other side of the mirror image had lost control, but he had no choice but to use the third lightning vortex to resist the power of the lightning vortex that had gone out of control. It was only then that Guyangfeng realized the extent of Jiang Shenwu's power. Looking at the spinning speed of the lightning vortex on the other side of the mirror image, Guyangfeng was shocked. Even at his peak, he hadn't reached such a height. Kang Xinmu reached it easily. Now, even though Guyangfeng had witnessed the strength of Kang Xinmu's control of the lightning vortex, he refused to believe that this was Kang Xinmu's true strength. In his eyes, Kang Xinmu was just a junior who had obtained some opportunities by chance. However, Guyangfeng tried his best, but still failed to use the third lightning vortex to resist the attack of the lightning vortex on the other side of the mirror image. In a breath's time, the power of the lightning vortex controlled by Kang Xinmu had already attacked. Guyangfeng was astonished by how strong he was. In the end, Guyangfeng had to give up the third lightning vortex. Even so, he still couldn't resist the attack of the lightning vortex controlled by Kang Xinmu. "I told you, your lightning vortex has serious drawbacks." Kang Xinmu glanced at Guyangfeng, who had been repelled, and sneered. "This is impossible." Guyangfeng kept muttering, and finally, as if he had made up his mind, he suddenly stood up. He had been forced to this point by Kang Xinmu, so he had no choice but to fight with him. Now, Guyangfeng could even think that the reason why he couldn't contact Feng Er was that she had been killed by Kang Xinmu. And Hai Fan, who had been missing for a long time. Guyangfeng's eyes were red. The seals in his hands changed quickly, and finally detonated the third lightning vortex. At the same time, there was also his own supreme divine power. Is this your counterattack before you die? You are worse than them. After going through the lightning vortex, Kang Xinmu roughly figured out Gu Yangfeng's real strength. Although his supreme divine power had reached the 8th level, or even the peak of the 8th level. But the power of the supreme fog was still inferior to the power of his supreme divine fire. What made Kang Xinmu afraid was probably the moment when the power of the supreme fog combined with the lightning vortex. This was Gu Yangfeng's strength. Naturally, Kang Xinmu would not allow him to release this move perfectly. Therefore, a long time ago, he had released the power of the Supreme Soul to block it. Boy, who do you think we are? Don't be too arrogant, or you won't even know when you will die. As soon as Gu Yangfeng's words fell, Kang Xinmu's attack had already arrived. At the same time, Kang Xinmu's figure had already approached. At this moment, Gu Yangfeng seemed to see a seal flash in Kang Xinmu's eyes. That is a seal. It was the seal they were looking for. Seal, Gu Yangfeng wanted to shout this news, but he did not have the chance. Kang Xinmu quickly ended Gu Yangfeng's life, and then flicked his sleeves and left. Moya was a little surprised to see Kang Xinmu walking over unscathed. After not seeing each other for a while, Kang Xinmu's cultivation had improved a lot. In particular, after comprehending part of the power of the seal, his entire strength had reached a qualitative leap. Not bad. Moya smiled gently. It's all thanks to the good opportunity created by Senior. Kang Xinmu was grateful to Moya from the bottom of his heart. His current strength was indeed inseparable from Moya's company. After the two left, the battlefield became lively. No one would have thought that the insufferably arrogant elder Gu Yangfeng of the Everlasting Pavilion would be defeated by a nobody. According to their conversation just now, perhaps Gu Feng, whom the Everlasting Pavilion's eldest senior brother was looking for, was most likely dead. Chapter 57:20. The news that Gu Yangfeng had been defeated by an unknown person spread like wildfire. Those who entered the secret realm were all famous sects in the outer realm. Even the itinerant cultivators were all big shots with some reputation. Hearing this news, everyone was ready to watch a good show. Everyone wanted to know what the Everlasting Pavilion was going to do about this matter. In fact, the Everlasting Pavilion appeared to be quite calm. Only the great senior brother of the Everlasting Pavilion, Dan Yuanfei, was frantically searching for Gu Feng's whereabouts. As for whether Gu Yangfeng would be defeated or not, no one cared. The news about the star map lock was not a secret in the outer realm. On the contrary, all the cultivators who entered the secret realm knew about it. They also knew that the 4 great sects in the outer realm had a map of the location of the star map lock. They even knew the specific location of the star map lock. What did the star map lock mean? It was equivalent to a Dharma seal. Later, a piece of news spread in the secret realm that the star map lock was a kind of spatial Dharma seal. Regardless of who spread the news, the Star Atlas lock had become a must-have for all the cultivators who entered this place. Because of this, more and more cultivators gathered in the secret realm. Tang Xiaoyu was the first cultivator to discover the location of the Dharma seal. He immediately told the news to Kang Xinmu. Kang Xinmu successfully obtained the Dharma seal and comprehended it. Comprehending the Dharma seal meant that the star map lock no longer existed. Instead, it was in the form of a Dharma seal and belonged to Kang Xinmu. Some cultivators went to the palace one after another. The palace that they saw this time was not as shabby as the one Kang Xinmu had seen. Instead, it was in a new state. The new palace door was also open. They could still see the Dharma seal in the palace. For this reason, they used all their skills to compete for the Dharma seal in the palace. After defeating Gu Yangfeng, Kong Xinmu and Moya returned to the cave residence. As soon as the two of them arrived at the surface of the cave residence, they were shocked by the scene in front of them. The first time they went to the cave abode, they were chased underground by Gufeng. Only then did they see the cave abode with the star map lock. The Immortals' Cave was located underground where they were currently standing. The cave abode was dozens of feet above the ground. At this moment, they saw the cave abode standing on the surface. The cave abode that he saw underground was the same as what he could see now. Even the array formation at the entrance of the cave abode was restored by some cultivators. Tsk tisk. Kong Xinmu sighed. The cultivators who came this time are really crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Moving the cave abode to the surface was a powerful move, but he did not expect that there would be an even more powerful move, which was to restore the formation at the entrance of the cave abode that he had destroyed. I can tell that he has not only unleashed his supreme divine power, but he has also unleashed some sort of secret technique. Moya's beautiful eyes swept the abode before her as she spoke in a soft voice. It feels like the power of the Supreme Holy Land? The reason why Kong Xinmu was uncertain was that there were indeed traces of the power of the Supreme Holy Land, but it did not seem to be limited to this type of supreme divine power. There is the power of the Supreme Holy Land, but there should be two other types of supreme divine power. Moya sized him up for a moment and said gently. 3 types of supreme divine power? Kong Xinmu was a little surprised. Moya nodded. Kong Xinmu released his soul consciousness again to sense. The space around the cave abode seemed to have traces of distortion. Power of space? Could it be the power of supreme space? Although the passageway into this mystic realm contained many elements of the power of nature, he had devoured all of them. Now, there should be the power of nature in the passageway that contained the power of supreme space. Very similar. Even Moya could sense the existence of the power of supreme space. Since the other party had unleashed the power of supreme space, he must have wielded the power of supreme space before it became a single supreme divine power. If that was the case, it was not surprising that this person possessed 3 types of supreme divine power. A cultivator of such strength could move the cave abode out and even restore the formation at the entrance of the cave abode. It was most likely something that could be done easily. Then, here came the question. Was the star map lock still in the cave abode? Other than the power of the Supreme Holy Land and the power of supreme space, there was another type of supreme divine power that Kong Xinmu could not guess at the moment. If he did not sense it, why did he determine that there were 3 types of supreme divine power? Of course, it was because of the seal. The seal tempered one's soul consciousness, and one's soul consciousness could sense traces of supreme divine power. He could sense the power of the Supreme Holy Land and the power of supreme space because he possessed these 2 types of supreme divine power. As for the 3rd type, he could only sense traces of it being unleashed, but he could not determine it. Senior, what is the 3rd type of supreme divine power? Since he could not think of it, he asked Moya. The traces of the 3rd type of supreme divine power are a little vague, so I am not very sure. However, we can determine it from the cave abode itself, Moya said gently. Hearing that, Kong Xinmu sized up the cave abode again. The cave abode was exactly the same as the one he had seen for the first time. The formation had also been restored perfectly. On the surface, there did not seem to be any major problems. Wait a minute. Restored. A light bulb went off in Kong Xinmu's head. The formation at the entrance of the cave abode had been restored. Also, the appearance of this cave abode was exactly the same as the appearance when they had first entered the cave abode. It had been so long. Many cultivators should have found the cave abode and discovered the existence of the star map lock. Because of that, a battle was unavoidable. The cultivators who came here were all powerhouses with supreme divine power of level 5 or even level 6 and above. If they were to fight, the cave abode would definitely be destroyed. Now that the cave abode had appeared on the surface, it meant that the cave abode had been restored. Power of restoration? Kang Xinmu stated the conclusion that he had made based on his observations. It should be the power of restoration. Moya analyzed and came to a conclusion. Supreme power of restoration? Kang Xinmu pondered about this supreme divine power. This is not a single supreme divine power. It is a type of multi-element supreme divine power, Moya added. Senior. Kang Xinmu suddenly realized something serious. Hearing that, Moya's beautiful eyes fell on Kang Xinmu. Do you still remember the 9 types of supreme divine power that I devoured from the crimson haze? Kang Xinmu said. Huh. Moya knew what Kang Xinmu was going to say when she heard that word. Among the 9 types of supreme divine power, there is a supreme power of restoration? It seems a little different. Kang Xinmu sensed again and realized that among the 9 types of supreme divine power that he possessed, there was no supreme power of restoration. It is the power of restoration. Kang Xinmu confirmed again and said. Supreme power of restoration? Moya's beautiful eyes lit up. Yes. Kang Xinmu found it strange too. Chapter 57:21. Supreme Regenerative Force restores the surface of the damaged object, while Supreme Regenerative Force restores the inner part of the damaged object. Moya pondered for a moment according to her observation and said. The cave abode that appeared in front of them looked the same as before. It had obviously been restored. The formation guarding the entrance of the cave abode was indeed destroyed by Gufeng back then. Now that it appeared at the entrance of the cave abode intact, it had also been restored. At this time, there were also cultivators coming in one after another. Although the cultivators who came later were obstructed by the formation, the strength of the formation was obviously not as strong as when Kang Xinmu first opened it. In other words, the formation had only been restored. In other words, the other party was using Supreme Regenerative Force. Obviously, Supreme Regenerative Force could only restore the surface of the object, but not the inner part of the object. It was the same for the cave abode. The parts of the cave abode that were revealed to the cultivators had already been restored. But inside the cave abode, there were still some traces left by the cultivators who had gone through a battle. It had not been completely restored. I see. After listening to Moya's explanation, Kang Xinmu had a rough understanding of the difference between Supreme Regenerative Force and Supreme Regenerative Force. In other words, he had Supreme Regenerative Force and could restore the inner part of the damaged object. If he comprehended Supreme Regenerative Force, didn't it mean that there was no such thing as injury? He could completely use Supreme Regenerative Force to heal his injuries. This was simply a kind of heaven-defying Supreme Regenerative Force. Kang Xinmu, although Supreme Regenerative Force can restore the inner part of the object, it can't heal by itself. Moya knew what Kang Xinmu was thinking and could not help but chuckle. Can't heal by itself? Kang Xinmu could not hide the disappointment on his face. He suddenly felt that this Supreme Regenerative Force was not very useful. It's not that it can't heal by itself. If you reach a certain level, you can heal by yourself. Moya said softly. If the Supreme Regenerative Force reaches level 9, and you have an epiphany of the rules, you can use the mysterious power of the rules to achieve the goal of self-healing. Of course, there are other conditions. Level 9? Conditions? Kang Xinmu could not help but laugh when he heard this. He hadn't grasped the Supreme Recovery ability yet, so it was still too early to think about this. Once you grasp the Supreme Recovery ability, you will naturally slowly understand it, Moya said. Kang Xinmu did not continue to dwell on the Supreme Regenerative ability. First, he had to solve the current situation. Since the cave had already been moved out, the Star Atlas lock would also be moved out along with the cave. Wait a minute. No. Suddenly, Kang Xinmu thought of an extremely serious matter. The reason why they couldn't obtain the Star Atlas Lock was because the Star Atlas Lock was surrounded by the power of magic. Without dispelling the dermic might, he would not be able to take away the Star Atlas Lock. If the power of magic still existed on the Star Atlas Lock, even if the cave abode was moved out, the Star Atlas Lock should still be in its original position underground. Senior. Kang Xinmu called out to Moya, and Moya understood. The two of them took a detour around the cave and returned to the underground via the original route. After the cave was moved away, a bottomless pit appeared on the ground. Logically speaking, the Star Atlas Lock should exist somewhere in the pit, and it was very likely to be floating in the center of the pit. However, the two of them did not find the Star Atlas Lock. Kang Xinmu released his soul consciousness and extended it throughout the pit, but he could not find the Star Atlas Lock. Could it be that the Star Atlas Lock is also in the cave abode? Kang Xinmu did not dare to believe it. To move the Star Atlas Lock, one had to first crack the power of magic. Could it be that that person had cracked the power of magic? Let's go up and take a look, Moya said. The two of them came to the surface again. More and more cultivators entered the cave abode, but from the beginning, there were only cultivators entering, and no cultivators coming out. Seeing this, Kang Xinmu could not help but be vigilant. Kang Xinmu, I keep feeling that there's something fishy going on. Moya observed the cave abode, and even used her divine power to check it. The cave abode was still the original cave abode, but it gave off a very unfamiliar feeling. Senior, why don't you wait here? I'll go in and take a look first, Kang Xinmu said after thinking for a while. No, let's go together. Kang Xinmu was worried about Moya, and Moya was also worried about Kang Xinmu. The cultivator who moved the cave abode was an expert with 3 types of supreme divine power. It was really dangerous for Kang Xinmu to go in alone. But, before Kang Xinmu could finish his words, he saw a spear piercing over from the side. He hurriedly pulled Moya and dashed to the side. The spear missed and stopped in midair. Immediately, a young man in a red and green silk robe dashed over from the side, holding a spear that flashed with green light. This person was dressed in fancy clothes, and the spear was not only green, but also flashed with other colors. However, the spear's handle was engraved with the mark of Everlasting Pavilion. He was sure that this person was from Everlasting Pavilion. You too, He Zhanghai glanced at Kang Xinmu, then his eyes fell on Moya. The ferocious look on his face disappeared in an instant and was replaced by a flattering smile. I'm He Zhanghai, may I ask for your name? He Zhanghai stared straight at Moya and grinned. Moya was disgusted and ignored him. He Zhanghai didn't feel awkward at all. Instead, he laughed and said, I like a reserved girl like you. Moya still did not say anything. From the moment He Zhanghai's eyes fell on Moya, Kang Xinmu's face did not look good. He stood in front of Moya, protecting her behind him. It's a pity that such a beautiful flower is stuck in cow dung. He Zhanghai's attention finally fell on Kang Xinmu, and his words and actions showed his disdain for Kang Xinmu. Seeing Moya closely following behind Kang Xinmu, he inexplicably developed a deep hostility for Kang Xinmu. If he killed this guy, he could get the beauty. He Zhanghai, who only wanted Moya, completely forgot the purpose of this trip. Cow dung, do you dare to fight with me? He Zhanghai pointed the spear in his hand at Kang Xinmu and shouted. Kang Xinmu naturally would not pay attention to He Zhanghai. If he agreed, wouldn't it mean that he admitted that he was cow dung? The two glanced at He Zhanghai, then turned around and left. Stop. He Zhanghai obviously did not want to let the two go, especially since he did not want Moya to leave with Kang Xinmu. If you don't have the guts to fight with me, then let go. Don't delay the girl. He Zhanghai's words made the passers-by laugh. Chapter 57:22. You don't even know the details. Don't pretend to be knowledgeable. He Zhanghai scolded coldly when he heard that. Ha! The crowd burst into laughter because of his words. There were 4 major sects in the outer region, and the Everlasting Pavilion was one of them. However, the people in the outer region basically only acknowledged the status of the Everlasting Pavilion on the surface. After all, the ancestors of the Everlasting Pavilion had established themselves earlier. The reason why the Everlasting Pavilion could become one of the 4 major sects was not because of their strength, but because they were the first to arrive. Of course, the fact that the Everlasting Pavilion could establish itself among the 4 major sects for thousands of years meant that the sect's foundation was strong enough. Among the 4 major sects, when some keywords were mentioned, they would think of the corresponding sect. For example, when the myriad origin superimposition technique was mentioned, it would be related to the Heaven Yuan Palace. But the Everlasting Pavilion was different. Each elder had a corresponding elder's secret technique, and each elder's secret technique was different, and it would not be passed on to the next generation. This kind of behavior was really confusing. When the Everlasting Pavilion was mentioned, most people in the outer region would unanimously think of a sentence: when a sect is big, there are all kinds of people. They were already used to He Zhanghai's behavior. Putting aside He Zhanghai's character, He Zhanghai looked decent, and his strength was also very strong. He was an outstanding young disciple. Unfortunately, this person was a infatuated person. He loved everyone he saw, and if he couldn't get them, he would destroy them. The girls that he had his eyes on never had a good ending. Everyone glanced at the girl that He Zhanghai had his eyes on, which was Emoya, and couldn't help but feel sympathy. This girl had an extraordinary temperament and a graceful figure, just like a pretty beauty that had entered the mortal world. She followed Kang Xinmu, and other than being a little weak, everything else was not bad. This person, from the first time Kang Xinmu saw He Zhanghai, he felt that this person was not a decent person. Sure enough, as soon as he opened his mouth, he revealed his true nature. Kang Xinmu didn't want this kind of person to disturb Emoya, so he wanted to leave with Emoya. However, He Zhanghai didn't have any eyesight. He couldn't see Emoya's disdain for him, and Kang Xinmu's hostility towards him, so he repeatedly stopped him. Kang Xinmu. Emoya called out to Kang Xinmu softly. Wait for me here, I'll go meet him, and then we'll go to the cave together. Kang Xinmu couldn't take it anymore. This was the first time he had seen such a high-quality item. Miss, are you going there? I'll go with you. He Zhanghai looked at the cave and waved his hand. The door of the cave opened completely. The door was destroyed, but it did not reveal the interior of the cave. Moreover, no cultivators could be seen at the entrance of the cave. The cultivators who entered the cave abode seemed to have disappeared from the cave abode. There's a formation protecting this place, as well as the might of the Star Atlas Lock. It's extremely dangerous, He Zhanghai said lightly. Halfway through his words, he suddenly cast a spell at Kang Xinmu, knocking Kang Xinmu into the cave's entrance. Kang Xinmu's mind was focused on the white figure that flashed at the entrance of the cave abode. He was not careful and fell into the trap. Emoya had been on guard against He Zhanghai. Seeing this scene, she protected Kang Xinmu first and entered the cave abode with Kang Xinmu. Cave abode. After Kang Xinmu and Emoya entered, they found that the scene inside was the same as what they saw at the time. The only difference was the entrance of the cave abode. Standing in the cave abode, they couldn't see outside the cave abode. The scene that they saw was the scene inside the cave abode. Even the position of the entrance was the furnishings in the cave abode. The two of them tried and they could still pass through this place. Even so, they were still in the cave abode and did not leave the cave abode. Kang Xinmu, this cave abode has really been modified by someone. Emoya sized up the situation in the cave abode and said in a deep voice. Yes, let's not separate from each other. Kong Shinmu nodded. As soon as he said that, Kong Shinmu's eyes fell on the place where they came in. A fierce look flashed in his eyes. Moya looked at Kong Shinmu with a puzzled expression. That brat is so arrogant. We have to teach him a lesson. Kong Shinmu said calmly. After saying that, he formed a seal with both of his hands and pressed the space in front of him. Then, a door appeared in the space. The moment the door appeared, everything outside was revealed, including He Zhonghai, who was about to enter. How did you do it? Moya was a little surprised. Soon, she thought of how Kong Shinmu did it. Dermic seal, Kong Shinmu said. Kong Shinmu used the power of the dermic seal and soon found the strange thing at the entrance of the cave abode. The cave abode had been moved to the ground by that mysterious cultivator. At most, he had restored everything in the cave abode to its original state. However, because of the Star Atlas lock in the cave abode, he seemed to have moved the Star Atlas lock up, so he would definitely activate the power of the Star Atlas lock and produce all kinds of Dharma formations. Now, the door of the cave abode was a Dharma formation formed by the power of the Dharma formation. The thing that Kong Shinmu was afraid of was the cultivator who had done all this. He was the one who had 3 types of supreme divine powers. The white figure that flashed by just now was most likely that cultivator. After Kong Shinmu came in, he first released the supreme soul power. After ensuring that there were no problems in the surroundings, he began to release the power of the dermic seal. Kong Shinmu activated the Dharma formation at the door of the cave abode and combined the power of the dermic seal to separate the space in the Dharma formation and the space at the entrance of the cave abode. After doing all that, He Zhonghai came in. The moment he entered, Kong Shinmu activated the power of the dermic seal and sent He Zhonghai into the separated space. As for where the separated space would lead to, Kong Shinmu didn't know and didn't want to care. Then, the two of them came to the place where the Star Atlas lock was placed. The closer they got, the stronger the pressure they felt. In the end, the two of them released their supreme divine powers to resist the pressure and walked into the cave abode. The Star Atlas lock was still there. Not only did it exist, but the pressure that permeated the surroundings was getting stronger. Obviously, the power of the Star Atlas lock was still there. Perhaps it was because of the power of the Star Atlas lock, but there weren't many cultivators in the cave abode. Kong Shinmu didn't hesitate. He gathered the power of the dermic seal and got closer to the Star Atlas lock. The closer he got to the Star Atlas lock, the clearer he could feel the power of the dermic seal. The repulsive power of the dermic seal was so strong that it made it difficult for Kong Shinmu to even stand. He simply gathered the dermic seal again and released it. The dermic seal floated above the Star Atlas lock, stopped, and slowly rotated. At the same time, lines of words appeared on the Star Atlas lock. The densely packed words danced, and in an instant, they covered the entire cave abode. In the end, the words formed lines of lines, which looked like the dermic seal at first glance. The moment the pattern was formed, it fell on the dermic seal. When the two came into contact, Kong Shinmu felt the power of the dermic seal surrounding the Star Atlas lock. Its essence was indeed the power of rule. The power of the dermic seal finally fell into the dermic seal, which could be considered as breaking the power of the Star Atlas lock. Not only did the flame of undead spirits have to devour the corresponding power, but the owner of the flame of undead spirits also had to have a certain level of divine power. If the two reached the same level, the flame of undead spirits could evolve. This level was infinitely close to the realm of laws. After the flame of the undead evolved, it would become a type of nomological power. In reality, this kind of power was above the supreme divine power, but it was inferior to the rule power. At that time, the flames of undead spirits would be able to create an undead barrier. The flame of undead spirits was the power of the undead spirit tribe from the other world. Under normal circumstances, the cultivators of this world could sign a contract with the living beings of the other world and bring them to this world if they had a summoning artifact of a higher level. When the dead spirit race of the 4 great corpse ancestor clans passed through the contract gate, if the flame of the undead spirits had the undead spirit barrier, it would gradually transform into a space barrier. This transformation process could be understood as an evolution after passing through the contract gate. Yes, I know. When Moya mentioned the other world, the first thing that came to Kang Shinmu's mind was flame of the undead spirits. For some reason, the flame of the undead spirits had become active after entering the cave abode. The space barrier around this cave abode is the undead spirit barrier of the other world's flame of the undead spirits, Moya said in a serious tone. Flame of the undead spirits? Kang Shinmu was a little confused. You can understand it this way. The flame of the undead spirits is comparable to a supreme divine power. It's the same as the replication power of the Nangong family's bloodline inheritance that you came into contact with. Moya thought for a moment and said softly. Compared to supreme divine power, the flame of the undead spirits will be similar to other supreme divine powers. When the cultivator's strength reaches a certain level, they will achieve the goal of advancing. When the flame of the undead spirits reaches the 9th level, it will infinitely approach the power of the rule. At that time, the power of the barrier will be generated, which is equivalent to the rule. The power that is formed is the undead spirit barrier. Kang Shinmu basically understood Moya's explanation. Senior, because the flame of the undead spirits can only come to this world through the contract gate, the undead spirit barrier that is formed will transform into a space barrier. Is that what you mean? Kang Shinmu immediately deduced the reason for the appearance of the space barrier in the cave abode. At the same time, he also understood why the flame of the undead spirits would become active. That's right. Moya nodded. Senior, could it be that there is a space barrier in the cave abode, which causes the internal space pattern of the cave abode to change, creating an illusion that one can only enter but not exit? Kang Shinmu asked. You're right. However, it's not an illusion that one can only enter but not exit. It's the truth. Moya's beautiful eyes glanced straight ahead. There was an entrance to the space barrier right in front of them. Once one entered the entrance of the space barrier, one would be trapped in it and would be unable to get out of it. In other words, after entering the space barrier, one would fall into its own space and be lost within, unable to leave the cave abode. Even if a cultivator broke through the space barrier, they might not be able to return to the cave abode. That was the main reason why there were more and more cultivators entering the cave abode, but not many left. Senior, when Kang Shinmu realized the space barrier, he was suddenly worried about his and Moya's current situation. However, he soon realized that they did not enter the space barrier. According to the flame of the undead spirit's indication, there was an entrance that seemed to be a space barrier right in front of them. We didn't enter the space barrier, but we can't be careless because I realized that the space barrier will move at irregular intervals. Moya analyzed and said in a deep voice. The space barrier would move at irregular intervals, and if one was not careful, one would be sucked into it. I'm starting to not understand the purpose of that cultivator's actions. Kang Shinmu thought about it, but he still could not understand why the mysterious cultivator would do that. He had spent so much effort to move the cave abode to the surface, but his goal was not the star map lock. Since his goal was not the star map lock, what was the purpose of releasing the space barrier now? Could the other party be a member of the undead spirit clan from the other world? Since he was a member of the undead spirit clan, he must have contracted a Dharma artifact or someone related to it if he wanted to come to this world. Suddenly, Kang Shinmu clearly felt the flame of the undead spirits in his body move. The movement pointed to the back. Senior. Chapter 57-24. Just as the two of them moved away, the space where they were standing just now changed. Moya was powerful enough to sense that there was an extra layer of space. Kang Shinmu also sensed that there was an extra layer of space with the help of the Dharma seal. This feeling of the space layer reminded Kang Shinmu of the manifestation origin superposition technique. The extra space layer just now was one of the entrances of the space rampart that suddenly moved here. At the same time, the entrance of the space rampart in front of them also began to move slowly. The moment it moved, there was a slightly familiar aura coming from behind the rampart. It was He Zhanghai's aura. Jiang Shenwu raised his eyebrows. His figure moved and he swept over. He grabbed the space layer next to the space rampart, and with a sudden force, he pulled out a figure. It was He Zhanghai. Moya was not surprised to see He Zhanghai. Although Kang Shinmu had sent him to the space that was separated from the entrance of the cave abode, it was not the space rampart after all. For a disciple from a big sect like He Zhanghai, who had mastered all kinds of powerful techniques, it was only a matter of time before he left the separated space. It was just that she did not expect him to come out so quickly. Not only that, but he also concealed his aura and took advantage of the time when they were breaking the power of the Star Atlas lock to snatch the Star Atlas lock. "Yo, you're not bad, kid." After being caught red-handed by Kang Shinmu, He Zhanghai said with a fake smile. As soon as he saw Moya, he restrained his expression and tried to maintain his elegant demeanor. "Miss, if you need the Star Atlas lock, I will give it to you." He Zhanghai's tone when talking to Moya was completely different from how he talked to Kang Shinmu. Even his voice had changed. If one only listened to the voice, it would be impossible to imagine that it was the same person who spoke. "You stay away from her." Kang Shinmu stood in front of He Zhanghai. The reason why he did not attack He Zhanghai immediately was that when Kang Shinmu pulled him out just now, he had sensed that this was just one of He Zhanghai's clones. This clone did not have the aura of the Star Atlas lock. If he wanted to find the main body, he would have to rely on this clone. This action of Kang Shinmu's cast He Zhanghai to take a yard after taking an inch. "This one is currently discussing official matters with Miss, please do not interrupt." He Zhanghai said indifferently as he shot a disdainful glance at Kang Shinmu. "You." Kang Shinmu raised his brows and curled his palm into a fist. "Die." Without any hesitation, he punched He Zhanghai in the chest. He Zhanghai's body flew out and hit the wall in front of him. "You brat." He Zhanghai didn't expect that Kang Shinmu would dare to attack him, and he was immediately enraged. Although this was only a clone, he was confident that he could defeat Kang Shinmu with just a clone. What he didn't expect was that after he was punched by Kang Shinmu didn't give him any chance to breathe and continued to attack. In a few breaths' time, He Zhanghai suffered dozens of punches from Kang Shinmu. Every punch contained Kang Shinmu's explosive Supreme Dragon Martial technique. Every punch hit the flesh, and every punch was fatal. Kang Shinmu only used a little bit of his Supreme Divine Power to completely suppress the meridians of He Zhanghai's clone, making him unable to use his Supreme Divine Power. He Zhanghai's face instantly darkened. However, he didn't even have a chance to speak before his life was cut off by Kang Shinmu. As long as it was his clone, whether it was alive or not, it wouldn't hinder him from finding the main body. Unfortunately, Kang Shinmu couldn't sense the aura of He Zhanghai's main body from this clone. Instead, he wasted some time here. Kang Shinmu can't find the main body's aura. Moya hated He Zhanghai, but she knew the importance of the Star Atlas lock to Kang Shinmu, so she checked the situation of this clone. Who knew that she couldn't use this clone to sense the main body's location? He Zhanghai must have abandoned this clone from the beginning. Not only that, but he also used a special method to block the aura emitted by the Star Atlas lock. This way, even if the Star Atlas lock's magic power was broken, others still wouldn't be able to sense the existence of the Star Atlas lock. It's okay. The seal can sense the Star Atlas lock's location. Kang Shinmu had already understood the power of the seal. This also meant that the Star Atlas lock seal belonged to Kang Shinmu. No matter where the Star Atlas lock was, Kang Shinmu could sense its location using the seal. Although they were delayed here for some time, Kang Shinmu and Emoya quickly caught up to He Zhanghai's main body. When he saw He Zhanghai, Kang Shinmu was shocked by He Zhanghai's strength again. The two of them watched him walk out of a space barrier as if nothing had happened. He Zhanghai was different from other cultivators. He wouldn't deliberately avoid space barriers. Instead, he could pass through them. His entire body was filled with a chilling aura. This aura was somewhat similar to Guyangfeng's lightning whirlpool. "Miss, I've more or less figured out the situation here. Do you need me to bring you out?" He Zhanghai was always humble and polite in front of Emoya. Emoya glanced at He Zhanghai indifferently and didn't say anything. "No need." Kang Shinmu coldly rejected He Zhanghai. "Who are you to the miss?" When He Zhanghai faced Kang Shinmu, not only did his face turn gloomy, but the aura around him also suddenly turned cold. "What do you think?" Kang Shinmu raised his eyebrows and said indifferently. "I don't care what your relationship with the miss was before. From now on, you and her will be separated from each other." When He Zhanghai finished speaking, he pressed his hand between his eyebrows. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The entire space began to tremble. An extremely oppressive aura was emitted from He Zhanghai's body. Kang Shinmu blocked this impact for Emoya. At the same time, he also sensed what this force was. This aura contained the power of replication. In other words, this was the Nangong family's bloodline inheritance. Looking at He Zhanghai again, he had already completed his previous action. The moment he moved his hand away, the space between his eyebrows was revealed. There was a blood-red mark between his eyebrows. The shape of the mark was oval. After having such a mark between his eyebrows, He Zhanghai's entire aura changed. Then, with a wave of his hand, a white jade folding fan appeared in his hand. He Zhanghai opened the white jade folding fan and saw that there was an item on it. It was the Star Atlas lock. "I've underestimated you." He Zhanghai glanced at the Star Atlas lock on the white jade folding fan, then raised his eyes to look at Kang Shinmu. His eyes and brows were filled with hostility. "The magical seal has actually fallen into your hands." His tone suddenly became cold. The Star Atlas lock was a thorny item. That was why he had concealed its aura and wanted to take it away first. However, he had never thought that Kang Shinmu would still come looking for him. Not only that, but he had also interrupted his secret technique. Chapter 57-25. As Kang Shinmu operated the power of the seal, he could vaguely sense that there was a bit of dermic might within it. After breaking the dermic might on the Star Atlas lock, the dermic might disappeared, and then the Star Atlas lock was taken away by He Zhanghai. It was only now that Kang Shinmu noticed the dermic might. After the seal broke the dermic might, it integrated into the seal. In other words, the dermic might that accompanied the Star Atlas lock now belonged to him. As Kang Shinmu gathered the dermic might, he could feel an abnormally powerful force enter his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. This kind of power was somewhat similar to the Supreme Soul Power. The difference was that the Supreme Soul Power was a kind of spiritual type Supreme God power. The dermic might, on the other hand, was comparable to the power of rules. To be exact, it was a kind of rules. Dermic might, as its name suggested, was the majestic power of law. Originally, law represented a broader meaning, but this was the Star Atlas lock's dermic might. Law also meant space. Mastering the Star Atlas lock's dermic might could achieve the goal of verbal law enforcement. In other words, as long as it was within the scope of one's ability, one could use the teleportation formation to reach the destination even if one didn't know where the place was. Now, Kang Shinmu had this power. Of course, To reach the realm of verbal law enforcement, one still needed to step into the door of rules. This aroused Kong Shinmu's fighting spirit towards rules. If a transcendent God realm cultivator wanted to reach the Supreme God realm, they needed to devour the existing Supreme God realm and comprehend the Supreme God realm to reach the Supreme God realm. After comprehending the Supreme God realm, one had to keep comprehending it and continue to advance to the Supreme God realm. To advance to the Supreme God realm, other than constantly strengthening one's soul and consciousness, one had to keep fighting. The so-called fighting, to put it simply, was to absorb the corresponding Supreme God realm and achieve the goal of advancing to the Supreme God realm. What couldn't be ignored was that in the boundless universe, every type of Supreme God realm could devour the corresponding power of nature. For example, the Supreme God realm's power of nature was all the power of fire that existed in the world. The power of the Supreme Divine Flame could devour the power of the flames in the natural world. After continuous refinement, it could increase the power of the Supreme Divine Flame. Kong Shinmu's unparalleled godly fire had already reached the 8th level. Previously, in the ancient desolate city, he had devoured several kinds of flame energy. At that time, the situation was more critical, so Kong Shinmu did not completely absorb them. At this moment, after the power of the Star Atlas Lock was absorbed by the Dermic Seal, it became Kong Shinmu's own power. This power of magic drew in his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness, causing the Supreme Divine Fire domain to suddenly spread out. Even the Supreme Divine Fire power began to circulate on its own. As the Supreme Divine Fire continued to circulate, all the fire energy it had absorbed earlier was refined and became a part of the Supreme Divine Fire. The unparalleled power of the Divine Flame, which had refined all the power of the flames, became even stronger. It was still actively operating, absorbing the surrounding flame power. The flame of the dead spirits within the extreme 10-directional Devil Seal was directly engulfed by the power of the Supreme Divine Fire. At this moment, the flame of the dead spirits had completely become the Supreme Divine Fire power. After devouring the flame of the dead spirits, the Supreme Divine Fire power had become stronger in nature, and its appearance had also changed. The flame of the dead spirits was now dark green, and the Supreme Divine Fire power had also turned dark green. In other words, it would be more appropriate to call the Supreme Divine Fire power the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame now. After the Supreme Divine Fire power had turned into the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame, it was slightly restrained. However, due to the influence of the surrounding space barrier, the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame did not stop and was still constantly circulating. It gave Kong Shinmu the feeling that the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame had formed layers of barriers. Kong Shinmu had mastered the power of magic, so he had a better understanding of the surrounding space, especially the surrounding space barrier. He could even clearly see every entrance of the surrounding space barrier, as well as the direction of the movement of the space barrier. With the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame, Kong Shinmu could determine that the person who had used the surrounding space barrier was not someone from the other world. It was more like someone had mastered the flame of the dead spirits and refined it to form a new type of power, which was how the space barrier was created. The refining method was the same as how he had refined the flame of the dead spirits. What Kong Shinmu was not sure about was whether the other party had the Supreme Divine Fire power. If the Supreme Divine Fire power had absorbed the flame of the dead spirits and created the space barrier, it would mean that the person had mastered 4 types of Supreme Divine powers at the same time. This person's strength had far exceeded what Kong Shinmu had imagined. The white figure that flashed by at the entrance of the cave abode might have been the mysterious cultivator. The changes that had happened to the Supreme Divine Fire power in Kong Shinmu's body were naturally within He Zhonghai's sensing range. Although He Zhonghai was not sure what kind of fire power Kong Shinmu had absorbed, there was one thing that was clear, and that was that Kong Shinmu's Supreme Divine Fire power had changed. However, no matter how the Supreme Divine Fire power changed, it was just a diversified type of Supreme Divine powers, which was nothing to be afraid of. Since you have a death wish, I'll grant you your wish. He Zhanghai's cold eyes were filled with murderous intent. He waved his white jade folding fan and his figure suddenly disappeared on the spot. When he reappeared, he was already next to Kang Xinmu. His speed was fast, but it was within Kang Xinmu's grasp. Although Kang Xinmu's reaction was fast, he was still a step slower than He Zhanghai. Moya had been paying attention to He Zhanghai's every move since the beginning. Before He Zhanghai waved his white jade folding fan, Moya circulated her supreme divine powers and brought Kang Xinmu to the side immediately. When He Zhanghai's figure appeared, Moya had already brought Kang Xinmu away from his attack. Moya's action caused He Zhanghai's attack to miss, and it also made He Zhanghai develop a sense of reverence for Moya. "You're indeed the lady that I admire." He Zhanghai's eyes were cold, but there was an unconcealable smile on his face. When Moya heard that, she retracted her gaze. She paid attention to He Zhanghai just now because she was afraid of his power, and not because of any other feelings. The aura of power that leaked out from He Zhanghai's body was very strange. Especially just now, when his figure moved, whether it was the surrounding air or the surrounding space, there was no trace at all. Just like when Kang Xinmu had just cracked the power of magic on the Star Atlas lock, He Zhanghai had also suddenly appeared and snatched away the Star Atlas lock. He learned from others that every elder of the Everlasting Pavilion had a specific secret technique. Could it be that this He Zhanghai was also an elder of the Everlasting Pavilion and had some kind of mysterious secret technique? Kang Xinmu had lingering fears. The power that He Zhanghai displayed just now could also be classified as space-related. That was not supreme divine powers, but it was even better than supreme divine powers. Chapter 57-26. Miss, could you please step aside and let me deal with this troublemaker first? He Zhanghai's eyes were merciful to Moya, but when he looked at Kang Xinmu, his eyes were filled with cold killing intent. Moya naturally would not step aside. She even had the urge to take the initiative to get rid of He Zhanghai. Kang Xinmu protected Moya tightly behind him. Even if he was not He Zhanghai's opponent, he had to protect Moya. Moreover, this was only the strength that he had shown on the surface. No matter how strong an opponent was, there would be a certain flaw. Moreover, he had to get the star map lock back. He Zhanghai saw Kang Xinmu's action and thought that it was because Kang Xinmu was forcibly preventing Moya from leaving, so he controlled his attack. It was not enough to hurt Moya, but it was enough to deal a heavy blow to Kang Xinmu. However, he ignored Kang Xinmu's ability. Kang Xinmu seemed to be able to see his attack clearly and always avoided it one step ahead. You took away Gufeng's power? By now, He Zhanghai had already seen through it. Kang Xinmu could clearly see through his positional spell, so he must have taken away Gufeng's power. He Zhanghai had two spells. One of them was the positional spell, Positional Vortex. It was a spell that used an array to create a vortex of power. The other was Phantom Vortex. As the name suggested, it was a movement spell. Just now, He Zhanghai used the Phantom Vortex secret spell to take away the star map lock from Kang Xinmu and Moya. Now, the secret spell that He Zhanghai used to deal with Kang Xinmu was the Positional Vortex. Kang Xinmu avoided the attack of the Positional Vortex so easily, so he could not help but think that Gufeng's power had already fallen into Kang Xinmu's hands. Back in the Wuxia Pavilion, Gufeng had taken a fancy to the Positional Vortex secret spell, so she took it away and imprisoned it on the magic tool Bloodstain. The bloodstain itself was soaked in the power of the Crimson Flame Qilin's bloodline. Coupled with the Positional Vortex, its combat power soared. He Zhanghai had thought that Gufeng had disappeared to search for new treasures in the mystic realm. After all, Gufeng loved all the treasures in the arcane realm. Even if someone else had already dug them out, she still wanted to get her hands on them. Now, it seemed that Gufeng's disappearance was definitely related to this kid in front of him. You mean the bloodstains? Kang Xinmu did not avoid anything. He moved away and said calmly. The moment He Zhanghai unleashed the vortex field, Kang Xinmu sensed the nature of this secret technique. It was similar to the field spell released by Gu Feng's blood scar. The only difference was that the two used different methods of release. After defeating Gu Feng, although Kang Xinmu did not intend to refine the bloodstains, he still checked the hidden power within them. Naturally, Kang Xinmu had also learned a thing or two about the position-type spells in the blood scar. Now that he was facing He Zhanghai's formation whirlpool, he had the strength to resist it. Kang Xinmu's every move was within He Zhanghai's grasp. His reaction proved that Gu Feng's disappearance was related to him. Where's Gu Feng? He Zhanghai was on the other side of the secret realm. When he heard Dan Yuanfei's call, he rushed back. He did not know the details of what had happened here. When Kang Xinmu heard that, his eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not say anything. Not talking? Then you know where she is. Tell me, and I will spare your life. He Zhanghai believed that Gu Feng was strong, and she had the Nangong family's bloodline inheritance. It would not be a problem for her to deal with a wandering cultivator like Kang Xinmu. Gu Feng's disappearance could only be attributed to Kang Xinmu's opportunism. He did not defeat her with his real strength. The moment the two of them confronted each other, the surrounding space ramparts suddenly moved. Several entrances to the space ramparts rushed in this direction. They suddenly merged and expanded, forming a giant space rampart. It was not just this place. The other space ramparts in other places were also merging. In a few breaths, all the space ramparts in the entire cave had merged. In this way, the entire cave was enveloped by the space ramparts. The cave had become its own space. All the cultivators who came later would only be able to enter this new space. Moreover, this time, they could only enter and not leave. Only cultivators who had stepped into the gate of rules could use the power of rules to break through the shackles of the space ramparts. Only then could they leave. The essence of the space rampart was a rampart formed by the flame of the dead spirits. The dead spirits' rampart completely enveloped the entire cave. In other words, the entire cave was a kind of dead spirits' rampart. Everywhere would emit the aura of the flame of the dead spirits. The power released by the dead spirits' rampart on such a large scale caused the 8-god star plate to form a connection. The 8-god star plate began to shake. What is that thing? Soon, He Zhanghai discovered the 8-god star plate's aura. He narrowed his eyes and stared at Kang Xinmu. Kang Xinmu did not hold back. Since the 8-god star plate was connected to the surrounding space ramparts, he took out the 8-god star plate. Once the 8-god star plate appeared, it floated in the air, absorbing the aura of the dead spirits in the surrounding space. Star Devour. He Zhanghai recognized it. It was Haifan's summoning artifact, Star Devour. The cruel truth was already in front of him, so there was no need to say anything more. He Zhanghai did not hold back anymore. His first reaction was to gather his strength to retrieve the 8-god star plate. However, he did not expect that the 8-god star plate would reflect his strength. Everyone in the Everlasting Pavilion knew that Haifan had a summoning artifact, Star Devour, that could summon creatures from the other world. In the Everlasting Pavilion, there were also some summoning artifacts that could summon creatures from the other world. Therefore, they did not know much about Star Devour. After touching it, He Zhanghai realized that Star Devour was actually the 8-god star plate. 8-god star plate. He Zhanghai said word by word. Star Devour was the artifact of the disciples of the Everlasting Pavilion, so he had to get it back. Moreover, he had to get the 8-god star plate back. He Zhanghai glanced at Emoya and attacked again. This time, He Zhanghai released the Phantom Whirlpool secret technique. Kang Xinmu naturally could not capture He Zhanghai, who was using the Phantom Whirlpool secret technique. Just as he was about to condense the Dharma seal and Dharma power, he accidentally caught a glimpse of the 8-god star plate. The 8-god star plate took the initiative to attack. Although he could not see where He Zhanghai was, he could use the 8-god star plate to determine He Zhanghai's position. Moreover, no matter where He Zhanghai went, the 8-god star plate's attack would automatically follow. He Zhanghai never expected that his phantom whirlpool would be broken by the 8-god star plate. He was furious. The 8-god star plate could only be his. This made He Zhanghai even more determined to fight for the 8-god star plate. The 8-god star plate absorbed the breath of dead spirits in the surrounding space, and the entire artifact gradually returned to its original appearance. In time, as long as he found the lost base, this artifact could be considered the real 8-god star plate. After absorbing the breath of dead spirits around him, Kang Xinmu kept the 8-god star plate. He Zhanghai chased after him and got entangled with Kang Xinmu. The deterrence of their soul consciousness was very strong. When they collided with each other, it formed a barrier in the surrounding space, blocking everything from the outside world. Chapter 57-27. Inside the soul consciousness barrier, both He Zhanghai and Kang Xinmu were giving it their all. Hand over the 8-god star plate. He Zhanghai's eyes seemed to be covered by a layer of gray shadow. This layer of gray shadow kept changing as He Zhanghai spoke. Kang Xinmu could sense that this gray shadow was the phantom vortex secret technique. What He Zhanghai used just now was just the tip of the iceberg. He had not used the real phantom vortex yet, but he had used the formation vortex first. Kang Xinmu had already seen Gu Feng's formation technique, so he could make a simple solution to the formation vortex. However, as the gray shadow in He Zhanghai's eyes deepened, the surrounding formation vortex underwent a qualitative change. From the outside, it felt like the surrounding space had not changed at all, but was full of traps. As long as he moved slightly, he could trigger a chain attack from the formation vortex, and he would not be able to react in time. Kang Xinmu's guess was right. He could not move now. It was not just Kang Xinmu. If it were anyone else, no matter how strong the cultivator was, they would trigger the formation vortex secret technique if they entered the formation vortex. Once the formation vortex was triggered, they would not only face the restraints of the formation, but also the attacks from the phantom vortex. He Zhanghai's mastery of the phantom vortex had broken through the boundary. Not only could he use this secret technique with the formation vortex, but he could also use the phantom vortex as an offensive technique. Kang Xinmu did not move, but He Zhanghai would not let him get what he wanted. He Zhanghai controlled one of the formation bases and quickly approached Kang Xinmu. It seemed like he had moved the formation base, but in fact, he had moved the space where the formation base was. In other words, it was equivalent to Kang Xinmu moving his body. Kang Xinmu was constantly paying attention to the surrounding formation bases. When He Zhanghai controlled the formation base, Kang Xinmu wanted to kill He Zhanghai on the spot. If the conditions allowed, he would not hesitate to kill He Zhanghai. Brat, the 8-god star plate doesn't belong to you. Quickly hand it over before you die. He Zhanghai frowned and said coldly. What are you saying? Regardless of whether I am dead or alive, you want the 8-god star plate. Why do you need to ask so much? Kang Xinmu raised his eyebrows and said faintly. That's true. He Zhanghai coldly laughed and unleashed his unparalleled godly strength. For a moment, something like a spider web fell from the sky and trapped Kang Xinmu. Before the object even came close, Kang Xinmu could already feel the pressure coming from it. Moreover, as this thing approached, he could clearly sense that the power in his chi meridian was stagnating, and even flowing in reverse. This was He Zhanghai's supreme divine power, the supreme divine power that accompanied his supreme domain power. As a result, the moment this power poured out, even his soul and consciousness were affected. Kong Shinmu directly controlled the dermic seal and released the power of the dermic might. The moment the spider web came crashing down, Kong Shinmu used the power of the dermic might. What surprised Kong Shinmu was that after releasing the power of the dermic might, he did not teleport away as he had imagined. Instead, he was still standing in the same place. Seeing the spider web coming towards him, Kong Shinmu once again gathered the power of the dermic might. At this moment, He Zhanghai's face was terrifyingly gloomy. The spider web had already reached him, but it directly penetrated Kong Shinmu's body. No, it didn't penetrate. When the spider web passed by, Kong Shinmu's body did not feel the slightest bit of discomfort. After focusing his mind to examine it again, Kong Shinmu suddenly realized something. The power of the dermic might that he had used had brought him to a parallel space with the spider web, so its attack naturally missed. This scene caused He Zhanghai to be stunned. Was this the power of the dermic seal? Or the power of the dermic might? In the end, he had underestimated this brat. He Zhanghai's hand gestures changed rapidly, and the spider web in the space suddenly disappeared. Kaboom! Then, a series of explosions sounded in the space, followed by a gray aura that quickly filled the space. Being in a parallel space, Kong Shinmu could also feel the pressure brought by this gray aura. Moreover, when this gray aura approached him, it was obvious that the space was being eroded. You've only grasped a little bit of it. Do you really think this will save your life? He Zhanghai grinned hideously. His figure had already arrived at Kong Shinmu's side, and a swift and fierce palm attack followed. The palm attack carried a strong gust of wind, which was the supreme wind force. Including the gray aura that permeated the palm attack, it was the supreme thunder force. Just by looking at the gray aura, it was difficult to associate it with the thunder attribute. Moreover, this gray aura also had an extremely strong corrosive ability, which was a far cry from the thunder attribute. However, when Kong Shinmu faced this power, it was obvious that it had the thunder attribute. He had come into contact with the supreme thunder force in the past, so he was not unfamiliar with the supreme thunder force. The reason why He Zhanghai's supreme thunder force looked like this was most likely due to the influence of his secret skill. The combination of the formation vortex and the phantom vortex could enhance the supreme divine power to a certain extent. It was extremely unwise to fight head-on knowing that he could not win, so Kong Shinmu decisively chose to retreat. After a few rounds, He Zhanghai's expression became even uglier. Kong Shinmu was no match for him at all, but it was true that he could not catch Kong Shinmu's figure. There were a few times when he was about to catch Kong Shinmu, but Kong Shinmu was always able to dodge at the crucial moment by relying on the power of the dermic seal. Do you only know how to run? He Zhanghai's phantom vortex was a movement type of secret skill. When this secret skill was mastered, it could also allow one to travel freely in the corresponding space. He Zhanghai possessed the supreme thunder force and the supreme wind force. Combining these two types of supreme divine power, he could even be unafraid of space storms. He Zhanghai had already mastered the phantom vortex long ago, so it was naturally not a problem for him to deal with some superficial space techniques of Kong Shinmu. However, he was unable to use the power of the phantom vortex in this place. At this moment, the cave abode had already been covered by the space rampart. It was equivalent to the evolved space rampart becoming the boundary of the cave abode. Under the effect of the evolved space rampart, the cave abode had become a self-contained space that could only be entered and not exited. Before the space rampart had fully evolved, some cultivators with powerful cultivation could still leave the cave abode. Now that the space rampart had fully evolved, even a cultivator with level 9 supreme divine power might not be able to leave. He Zhanghai's supreme divine power had already reached level 9 and was infinitely close to the gate of rules. When he used his supreme divine power, he could feel the pressure brought by the space rampart. This was also why he could not use the phantom vortex secret skill. With this kind of pressure, all the cultivators here would be restricted in all aspects. When He Zhanghai realized this, he also thought that Kang Xinmu would be pressured. However, after a round of teaching, He Zhanghai began to doubt his previous speculation. Chapter 57-28. He Zhanghai's eyes were fixed on Kang Xinmu as he released his soul consciousness to surround Kang Xinmu. After trying for a while, he was still unable to find out anything about Kang Xinmu. On the contrary, Kang Xinmu gave off an unfathomable aura. Moreover, Kang Xinmu easily avoided his supreme lightning and supreme wind power. Kang Xinmu's own supreme god power was at most at the 8th level. With his 9th stage supreme divine strength, how could he not be a match for an 8th stage supreme divine strength? While He Zhanghai was sizing up Kang Xinmu was also sizing up He Zhanghai. Relying on his powerful soul consciousness, Kang Xinmu was basically sure that He Zhanghai only had 2 types of supreme god power, supreme wind power and supreme lightning power. These 2 types of supreme god power had already reached the 9th level. Although the space barrier here had a kind of restriction on his power, combined with the position vortex and phantom vortex, He Zhanghai's power could still reach the height it should have. Kang Xinmu was also clear about the effect the evolved space barrier would have on the entire cave abode. Since he possessed the flame of the dead spirits and had already absorbed the flame of the dead spirits, his supreme divine flame had already evolved into the supreme divine flame. The essence of the space barrier was the flame of dead souls. With the supreme god flame, he would not be restricted by the space barrier. Kang Xinmu took advantage of this advantage to accurately control his power and take the initiative to attack He Zhanghai. The battle between the two gradually entered the space barrier. Coupled with the existence of He Zhanghai's position vortex, the two were completely separated from the cave abode. No matter what the situation of the battle between the two was, all the cultivators who entered the cave abode were unaware of it. This included Emoya. Although the battle was not far from her, she could not see the situation clearly. The only thing she could be sure of was that Kang Xinmu was not restricted by the space barrier. What Emoya was worried about was Kang Xinmu's supreme godly strength. Although Kang Xinmu's peerless divine strength had reached the 8th stage, compared to the 9th stage, the difference was like heaven and earth. It was not something that could be dealt with treasures. Moreover, sensing the subtle changes in the space in front of her, the thing that Emoya was worried about had come. Ever since Kang Xinmu stepped into the Supreme God stage, the first Supreme God power he chose to cultivate was the power of the Supreme God Flame. After that, he relied on actual combat and the continuous devouring of unparalleled divine power, allowing his unparalleled divine fire power to advance rapidly. Now, the peerless godly flame of the 8th level had completely absorbed the power of the flame of the undead spirits and evolved into a peerless godly flame. Although the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame belonged to the Supreme Divine Powers, it was far stronger than other Supreme Divine Powers of the same level. Obtaining this power meant that his power had changed, and he would have to undergo a lightning tribulation. Now, the subtle changes in the space that Emoya sensed were the signs of a tribulation. Kang Xinmu needed to go into seclusion and continuously refine before he could fully grasp the power of the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame. Going into seclusion was a stage that every cultivator had to go through in order to advance their power. But now was not the time. If he was even slightly distracted now, he might encounter an unforeseen calamity. The thing that Emoya was worried about happened to Kang Xinmu. When Kang Xinmu displayed the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame just now, he sensed the changes in the meridians in his body. This feeling was that he was about to undergo a tribulation. The fluctuations in the aura around him also fell into He Zhanghai's perception. He Zhanghai laughed sinisterly. Kid, looks like even the heavens aren't willing to help you. Tribulation transcendence was something that cultivators looked forward to very much. As long as they went through a tribulation, it meant that their power would increase. But in this case, the tribulation might turn into a life and death tribulation. If they could withstand the pressure from He Zhanghai and successfully undergo the tribulation, they would survive. If they couldn't withstand the pressure and failed the tribulation, they would die. Kang Xinmu definitely wouldn't choose to undergo the tribulation at this time, but reality didn't allow it. His tribulation had come. Without hesitation, Kang Xinmu released the 8-God star plate, summoning Lu Zi and Big Guy. "Thank you for your trouble." After saying that, Kang Xinmu sat down on the ground. The moment he sat down, layers of dark green flames appeared around him, surrounding his entire body. An aura that alternated between hot and cold suddenly spread out. "Yes, Master." Lu Zi and Big Guy weren't strangers to He Zhanghai at all. "Do you think you can stop me?" He Zhanghai glanced at Lu Zi and Big Guy disdainfully. With that, he defeated the two of them. After quickly defeating the two, He Zhanghai quickly approached Kang Xinmu. Just as he was about to attack Kang Xinmu, he felt the pressure of the Supreme Divine Flame. It was clearly an 8th-level Supreme Divine Power, but it was suppressing his 9th-level Supreme Divine Power. This feeling made He Zhanghai very unhappy. Activating his soul consciousness, he condensed the two Supreme Divine Powers and approached Kang Xinmu. Unfortunately, when these two Supreme Divine Powers approached Kang Xinmu, they were blocked by the dark green aura surrounding Kang Xinmu. He Zhanghai naturally refused to believe it. A trivial 8th-stage Supreme Divine Force, how could it block his 9th-stage Supreme Divine Force? Furthermore, his Peerless Power of Wind and Peerless Power of Lightning were Peerless Saint Attribute Divine Powers. Kang Xinmu's Supreme Divine Fire Power was just a very ordinary Supreme Divine Power. Even if it advanced, its essence would not change, so there was nothing to fear. Thinking so, He Zhanghai once again used his Supreme Divine Power to deal with Kang Xinmu, who was meditating on the ground. This time, he approached Kang Xinmu, but all his attacks failed. Only then did he realize that Kang Xinmu had entered the spatial barrier. With the protection of the spatial barrier, he could not approach him. The power of magic had brought Kang Xinmu into the spatial barrier, so Kang Xinmu was naturally aware of it. Not only that, but he also controlled his power and quietly brought Emoya into the spatial barrier. He did not know how long it would take for him to transcend this tribulation, so he could not let Emoya be threatened. Kang Xinmu and Emoya both entered the spatial barrier. The 8-God star plate also followed Kang Xinmu into the spatial barrier. Lu Zi and the Big Guy were not He Zhanghai's opponents. After being defeated, they returned through the contract gate. He Zhanghai tried to use the 8-God star plate to enter the spatial barrier, but he saw that the contract gate was not closed. Immediately after, a shadow swept out from within. The aura this shadow exuded was very powerful. Although it was a creature from the other world, the strength of the cultivation it exuded was far beyond that of a supreme cultivator. He Zhanghai instinctively became vigilant. The shadow that swept out of the contract gate was Shenguang. Shenguang sensed that the environment of the 8-God star plate had changed dramatically, so he came out to check. Only then did he realize that the 8-God star plate had actually entered this spatial barrier. Shenguang was naturally not unfamiliar with spatial barriers. However, he knew very well that the person who created this spatial barrier was not the dead spirit clan of the other world's 4 great corpse ancestor clans. The caster's technique was even more brilliant. Moreover, the spatial barrier he created was filled with rules. Chapter 57-29. He Zhanghai had never seen Shenguang before, but he could faintly feel that the aura around Shenguang was very strong, very close to the 9th level of Divine Force realm. Star Eater was Everlasting Pavilion's disciple Hai-Fan's summoning instrument. It wasn't that he didn't know Hai-Fan, and he knew a thing or two about Hai-Fan. Other than Big Head and Lu Zi, Hai-Fan often summoned a creature from the other world called Cruel. Cruel was very strong, stronger than most of the Everlasting Pavilion's elders. He originally thought that Cruel was the strongest creature from the other world that Star Eater had signed a contract with. Unexpectedly, he saw a creature from the other world that was even stronger than Cruel. Shenguang. Shenguang glanced at He Zhanghai and said calmly. Shenguang. He Zhanghai's expression changed. He Zhanghai had heard of Shenguang before. Shenguang was the nightmare of the 4 ancestor corpse clans from the other world. 10,000 years ago in the other world, there was a huge event that shocked the entire world. It was a taboo existence in the other world. After that, the 4 ancestor corpse clans were divided. The person who caused that event was called Shenguang. This was something that He Zhanghai had heard when he was roaming the world. As for whether or not this Shenguang was that Shenguang, he couldn't prove his identity with just one sentence. He Zhanghai calmed his emotions and focused, once again sizing up Shenguang's cultivation. The aura that leaked out on the surface was indeed only at the 9th level of Divine Force realm. It wasn't enough to become the nightmare of the other world. Shenguang glanced at Kong Shinmu. Seeing that there was the aura of rules circulating around Kong Shinmu, he was surprised. After not seeing him for a while, Kong Shinmu's cultivation had actually reached such a level. His talent was really not bad. Kong Shinmu was currently in seclusion, and he didn't know what was happening in the outside world at all. As the power in his meridian circulated, his soul consciousness gradually condensed around his body. With the power of the seal, he formed a boundary, covering his entire body. Kong Shinmu was worried about Emoya, so he used his magical power to form a boundary to protect her. The moment the magical power was released, Shenguang's sharp senses sensed it. This was the magical power of the Star Atlas Lock, a kind of natural force. Once Kong Shinmu stepped into the Gate of Laws, it would signify that he would possess the power of the natural laws, the power of space. In other words, it was a type of space law. When that time came, as long as he grasped the space law seal, it would not be an exaggeration to say that no one would have a higher attainment than him in the aspect of space law. The moment the boundary formed by his soul consciousness enveloped Kong Shinmu, He Zhanghai sensed the existence of magic power. At this moment, He Zhanghai's face was terrifyingly gloomy. He thought that this kid Kong Shinmu was able to break through the power of the Dermic Might purely because he had the advantage of the Dermic seal. At most, he was just trying his luck to break through the power of the Dermic Might. Unexpectedly, Kong Shinmu has mastered the power of Dermic powers. Since that was the case, the second son must be eliminated. He Zhanghai unreservedly released his own power, causing the surrounding spatial barrier to tremble. The originally stable spatial barrier gradually began to operate due to the influence of He Zhanghai's power. Although the speed was very slow, the laws contained within it also began to operate. The laws of the spatial barrier began to operate, which meant that from this moment on, all cultivators who entered the cave abode had to abide by the laws of the spatial barrier. Otherwise, they would be lost within the laws of the spatial barrier. When the laws of the spatial barrier operated, many cultivators violated the laws and were sucked into it, getting lost within the spatial barrier. The spatial barrier was like a kind of boundary, separating the space of the cave abode from the outside world. This did not mean that the laws of the spatial barrier were absolute. Once this law was broken, they might face an even greater danger. In any space, once it was torn apart, the spatial storm within it would constantly emerge. The spatial storm was the strongest and most dangerous existence within the space. He Zhanghai did not care about anything and was determined to take down Kong Shinmu. However, he underestimated the boundary around Kong Shinmu. Moreover, this boundary seemed to be gradually strengthening. As Kong Shinmu's tribulation progressed, the boundary around him would only become stronger. He Zhanghai's eyes narrowed, and his hand gestures quickly changed. There were complex runes flashing from between his eyebrows. Some of the runes had already been imprinted on the boundary around Kong Shinmu. At this moment, the boundary clearly trembled a little. Seeing this, He Zhanghai sneered, "Do you really think that this level of boundary can protect you? You are." Shen Guang's eyes stared straight at the runes imprinted on the boundary. These runes exuded a powerful decomposing power, which was disintegrating the boundary. As the boundary trembled, the runes on it seemed to be growing stronger. No, the runes not only disintegrated the boundary, but also devoured the disintegrated part of the boundary to strengthen the power of the runes, which in turn accelerated the speed of decomposition. In this way, the boundary would be completely decomposed by the runes sooner or later. Moreover, by decomposing the runes of the boundary and devouring the power of the boundary, it would also become stronger. Although Kong Shinmu's boundary was continuously strengthening and the power of the runes was also increasing, it was very disadvantageous to Kong Shinmu. Shen Guang originally wanted to erase the runes on the boundary, but he found that his power had no effect on the runes. Instead, the runes seemed to have absorbed his power. These runes are from the other world. Seeing Shen Guang's action, He Zhanghai sneered. His meaning was already very clear. Let Shen Guang not waste his energy, otherwise, it would only accelerate the speed of decomposition of Kong Shinmu's boundary. Shen Guang retracted his hand gestures, but he was still somewhat unwilling. Just as he was in a dilemma, he suddenly saw a beautiful figure sweep to Kong Shinmu's side. A pair of slender hands changed into a very common seal, which was a common seal gesture for erasing. After doing all this, Moya's lily-white hands gently pressed on the boundary. The runes on the boundary all became transparent, and then disappeared. Moya actually erased the runes on the boundary. Shen Guang couldn't help but take another look at Moya. This woman had always been by the side of the 8 God Star Plate's owner, Kong Shinmu. This was the first time he saw her ability. Moya's erasing technique was very simple, and Shen Guang and He Zhanghai knew it too. Shen Guang couldn't erase the runes, but Moya did it. The difference was in the two's supreme divine power. Moya's supreme divine power was supreme holy power. Using this power in her own technique, it was indeed easy to erase the runes. Worthy of being the person that I like. He Zhanghai was slightly surprised by the fact that Moya possessed supreme divine power. Of course, Moya only used her power to help Kong Shinmu erase the runes, which made He Zhanghai very angry. In the end, He Zhanghai transferred all his resentment to Kong Shinmu. "You really talk a lot of nonsense." Moya's beautiful eyes focused, and she finally looked at He Zhanghai. In her beautiful eyes, there were waves of white mist surging. Then, Moya's lily-white hands changed into another seal, and a rune-like pattern appeared under her feet. This pattern looked simple, but it was a pattern that He Zhanghai had never seen before. The next moment, a similar pattern appeared under He Zhanghai's feet. Immediately, He Zhanghai felt that his movement was restricted. His attacks couldn't rush out of the range of the pattern. Moreover, there was the restriction of the space barrier here, which completely restricted He Zhanghai's movement. Without any reason, Moya used a teleportation technique on He Zhanghai. What kind of technique is this? He Zhanghai had naturally seen teleportation techniques before. They were techniques that used space to change the target's position. However, this was the first time he had seen a teleportation technique like Moya's. Before he could get a response, he was teleported away. Chapter 57:30. Shen Guang was a being from the other world. Although Moya had never dealt with Shen Guang before, she knew that he was a contracted being from the 8 God Star Plate. Knowing Shen Guang's general situation, Shen Guang's combat power far surpassed Kong Shinmu's. Moya was still afraid of Shen Guang. Shen Guang seemed to have read her mind, so he moved to the side. He didn't say much. He didn't explicitly say that he would protect Kong Shinmu during his tribulation, nor did he plan to return to the other world. He just stood there quietly. He Zhanghai had only been moved by Emoya. He quickly found the route that Emoya had moved and returned the way he had come. Returning the way he had come wouldn't trigger the rules of the space barrier and wouldn't be affected by the rules. Seeing He Zhanghai appear again, Emoya's beautiful eyes narrowed. This guy seemed to be much more difficult to deal with than she had imagined. "Miss, I won't hurt you. However, if you insist on protecting that kid, I might hurt you." He Zhanghai's tone was humble and polite when he faced Emoya. "Excuse me." As soon as he said that, several runes flew out of He Zhanghai's body again. The runes that appeared this time didn't look much different from the previous ones. What troubled Emoya was that she couldn't erase these runes this time. Moreover, He Zhanghai didn't hold back this time. He released two types of supreme divine powers. As the peerless power of wind and peerless power of thunder fused together, there seemed to be some sort of nomological power mixed within. Such a powerful force directly attacked the boundary around Kong Shinmu. Emoya didn't dare to be careless. She hurriedly gathered supreme divine power. Since she couldn't erase the other's power, she could at least weaken it. However, Shenguang was faster than her. He dashed forward and blocked the attack with his bare hands. Immediately, an extremely powerful force exploded from Shenguang's body and swept toward He Zhanghai. The two forces were similar in strength. Thus, they were in a stalemate, forming a relatively static state. Emoya's beautiful eyes stared at the place where the two forces collided. The small space formed by the static state didn't just open the door to the other world. It also opened the door to other worlds. Vaguely, Emoya felt a mysterious and familiar force. The static state only lasted for a moment before it was broken. Both of them took a few steps back, and soon, they were engaged in a fight. At that moment, within the boundary, Kong Shinmu, who was undergoing his tribulation, also felt an aura that was different from the other world. It was an extremely unfamiliar aura, but it was the seven devouring demon sealing art seal. The seal of the seven devouring demon sealing art, which had been in a closed state all this time, suddenly opened at this moment, and then released a devouring power. The devouring power released by the seven devouring demon sealing art swept out in all directions. This was an invisible power, and Jiang Shenwu could only sense its existence with his soul consciousness. With his current soul consciousness, he could only sense the devouring power released by the seven devouring devil sealing art spreading out and condensing at the point where He Zhanghai's and the divine light's powers collided. Following the brief pause of this devouring power, Jiang Shenwu could clearly sense that the aura of the remnant of the seven devouring devil sealing art had grown a bit stronger. Vaguely, it seemed like it was going to advance. Now, Kong Shinmu was sure that the brief moment when Guang and He Zhanghai's powers collided was a door to another world. Other than the other world, there must be a higher world. In that world, there were many rules. Although the door had only opened for a moment, it was still captured by the seven devouring demon sealing art's seal. It activated and released the seven devouring demon sealing art's devouring power, absorbing all the rules. After absorbing the rules behind the door, the first level of the seven devouring demon sealing art seal became more stable. The door closed after Guang and He Zhanghai fought again. However, the seven devouring demon sealing art's devouring power didn't retract. Instead, it continued to spread forward. Kong Shinmu released more of his Guang. He released the seven devouring demon sealing art's devouring power. Not long after, the seven devouring demon sealing art's devouring power approached the space barrier. After coming into contact with the space barrier, it seemed to sense the rules it contained. It spread along the space barrier at a speed that Kong Shinmu's Guang couldn't capture. This cave abode wasn't big, but it was affected by the space barrier. It expanded infinitely. Kong Shinmu's Guang couldn't cover the entire cave abode with his Guang. Since his guang couldn't capture the 7 devouring demon sealing art's devouring power, Kang Xinmu didn't retract his guang. Instead, he focused on his surroundings. The mysterious cultivator who set up the space barrier was definitely still in this space. He couldn't be careless. In reality, the mysterious cultivator who set up the space barrier was the white figure that Kang Xinmu saw when he entered the cave abode. His name was Hao Yan, and he was a disciple of the Shaoyun sect. He was also in the cave abode. Hao Yan moved the cave abode to the surface and released the space barrier. He wanted to refine the cave abode into a spatial artifact. He didn't move the cave abode to this place randomly. It was within his calculations. The place he chose was where the door to the parallel world was. Hao Yan's goal was to open that door and use the rules of the space barrier to refine a spatial artifact that could lead to the alternate world. In other words, it was an artifact that was similar to the star map lock. This kind of artifact was different from the star map lock. The star map lock was limited by the wielder's cultivation and the wielder's soul consciousness. It could also be understood that the distance or the degree of space that the star map lock could teleport was limited by the wielder's soul consciousness. The artifact that Hao Yan refined didn't have such a rule. As long as one understood the rules of the space barrier, one could control the artifact. Hao Yan sensed the devouring power released by Kang Xinmu's 7 devouring demon sealing art when it spread through the space barrier. However, Hao Yan was currently trying to open the door to the alternate world, so he couldn't leave for a while. Ever since Hao Yan entered the cave abode, he had changed the space barrier's layout several times just to open that door. For some reason, he could only sense the door, but he couldn't open it. This state continued for a period of time. Suddenly, Hao Yan sensed an extremely powerful force spreading through the spatial barrier. Then, the door opened. Although it only opened for a moment, Hao Yan seized the opportunity. He controlled his power, opened the door, and entered. He Zhanghai and the power of the divine light continued to collide, but the special door didn't open again. After Hao Yan entered the door, it meant that he had left the cave abode and the space barrier. The devouring power engraved by the 7 devouring demon sealing art circled the entire space barrier once before quickly withdrawing. The devouring power of the 7 devouring demon sealing art had already devoured all the rules of the space barrier. As for how strong the rules of the space barrier were, Kang Xinmu didn't have a clear idea. It wasn't until now that the 7 devouring demon sealing art had devoured these rules that he successfully entered the second stage. Only then did Kang Xinmu realize how strong the rules of the space barrier were. Although he had only grasped the basics of the supreme spatial force, Jiang Shenwu was still able to fully unleash the power of the supreme spatial force with the power of the seal. As for the power of the supreme holy domain, it was a power of supreme power of space. This was the power that Jiang Shenwu had devoured when a holy artifact of heaven and earth had perished. Since he had not grasped the power of the supreme holy ice, he could not unleash the power of the supreme holy ice domain. As Kang Xinmu mastered the power of space, the power of the supreme holy ice domain gradually merged with the power of space. As Kang Xinmu mastered the power of space, the power of the supreme holy ice domain gradually merged with it. This was actually not a good thing for Kang Xinmu. If the power of the supreme holy ice domain merged with the power of space, then he, who had mastered the power of the supreme holy ice, would not be able to condense the power of the supreme holy ice domain. When that happened, the power of the supreme holy ice domain that had merged with the power of space would also affect the condensation of the power of the supreme holy ice domain. This was what Kang Xinmu was worried about. However, this did not stop the fusion of the two powers. As he released his consciousness, the speed at which the two powers merged increased. Very soon, Kang Xinmu realized something. Although the power of the supreme holy ice domain and the power of space had merged, he could still sense the existence of these two powers. The power of the fusion was affected by the seal. After the two powers merged, it was equivalent to producing a new power. This power was essentially the power of the seal. Although Kang Shinmu could use the power of space, he still could not comprehend the power of the supreme holy ice. This also meant that he could not control the power of the supreme holy ice domain. After mastering the power of space, Kang Shinmu had a rough understanding of his own power. The first power that he comprehended was the power of the supreme divine fire. The power of the supreme divine fire was also the first power that was close to the 9th level. Later on, under the effect of the flame of dead spirits, it evolved into the supreme spiritual fire. The supreme flame of divinity stopped at the 9th level and didn't advance any further. Even though Kang Shinmu absorbed the power of fire in the universe, the supreme spiritual fire did not improve at all. On the contrary, the power of the supreme holy land, the power of the supreme dark iron, the power of the supreme soul, and the power of space that he had just comprehended started to improve. All this while, Kang Shinmu mainly cultivated the power of the supreme divine fire and neglected to cultivate these powers. Until now, when the supreme spiritual fire reached the 9th level, it stopped. The remaining supreme divine power began to absorb the natural power of the supreme divine power in the world, as well as the corresponding elemental power in the surrounding space. After a type of power reached the 9th level, theoretically, it would gradually come into contact with the rules, and cross the door of rules to explore the rules corresponding to the power of nature. Then, it would step into the realm of rules. However, until now, Kang Shinmu's supreme spiritual fire did not improve at all. Kang Shinmu had never heard of such a situation, let alone experienced it himself. He could not help but think of a possibility. He would only step into the realm of laws when all of his supreme godly powers reached the 9th level. If that was really the case, he would face another problem. He possessed more than a dozen types of supreme divine powers, and he only needed to cultivate all of them to the 9th level. Or could it be that there were still other types of supreme divine powers? It seemed that after reaching the supreme level, the system he cultivated gradually changed. Could it be that he was affected by the power of the supreme holy ice territory? Or was it affected by the power of devouring? As for the answer to this question, Kang Shinmu did not know. What he needed to do now was to refine the other types of power. Only then would he be able to get an accurate answer. Time passed just like that. Kang Shinmu's tribulation continued. Just like that, a year passed. In a year, the boundary around Kang Shinmu became stronger and stronger. Not only did the boundary protect Kang Shinmu, but it also protected Wuxia tightly. Kang Shinmu spent a year in seclusion while he Zhanghai and the Divine Light fought for a year. After a year, there was still no clear winner between the two. No one was more surprised than he Zhanghai. The living beings of the other world use their own power to pass through the door. Staying here for a long time will only weaken your power. How can you still have power? He Zhanghai could not understand this. Chapter 57-32. He Zhanghai narrowed his eyes and did not respond to the Divine Light directly. In a year, Divine Light had more or less figured out He Zhanghai's background. He had the same bloodline inheritance as Gufeng, which was the power of replication. Not long ago, it once again displayed its regenerative ability. The regenerative ability was not a kind of supreme divine power. Just like the replication ability, it was a special power inherited from the bloodline that was comparable to supreme divine power. However, the regenerative ability came from the lost clan, the Yuan family. Although they were both great hidden families, compared to the Nangong family, there was no information about the Yuan family in the world. The Yuan family was like a family that only existed in legends. No one knew where they were and no one had any traces of the Yuan family. Of course, there might be descendants of the Yuan family in this world, but under normal circumstances, no one would be able to discover them. One thing that could be confirmed was that the regenerative ability originated from the Yuan family. It was an inherited power of the Yuan family. However, the ability to regenerate was not inherited from the Yuan family's bloodline. As for what kind of power was inherited from the Yuan family's bloodline, there was no relevant explanation in later generations. What was certain was that the regenerative ability was an inherited power. Therefore, even if the Yuan family was hidden somewhere in the world, they would still find a suitable candidate to inherit the regenerative ability. He Zhanghai possessed the ability to regenerate, so he might be the successor of the Yuan family. In other words, He Zhanghai had someone who could contact the Yuan family. Why are you protecting that person? He Zhanghai paused and asked. Answer my question first. Shenguang glanced at Kang Xinmu and said in a deep voice. As you can see, I have a regenerative ability. He Zhanghai sneered. He naturally knew what Shenguang was thinking. But so what if he had the ability to regenerate? You know the whereabouts of the Yuan family? The divine light pursed her lips and asked. What do you think? He Zhanghai gave a thought-provoking answer. Divine light was actually not interested in the Yuan family. It just did not want Kang Xinmu to have a grudge with the Yuan family. After all, if they became enemies, Kang Xinmu alone would not be able to contend against the Yuan family. Of course, Kang Xinmu was a member of the Dragon God clan, which was also a famous clan. However, the Yuan family could not be underestimated. The Yuan family was an untouchable existence. Shenguang didn't ask anything else, but he naturally wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let He Zhanghai disturb Kang Xinmu's closed-door training. He Zhanghai had the regenerative ability, which gave him the ability to fight for a long time. For the past year, He Zhanghai had relied on his regenerative ability to survive until now. Moreover, not only did his strength not weaken, but he became even more valiant as he fought. He Zhanghai was no stranger to the Yuan family that Divine Light mentioned. However, this only made him more curious about the Yuan family. The regenerative ability he possessed did indeed come from the Yuan family, but it was not inherited from the Yuan family. Instead, it was inherited from someone else. The person who passed on the regenerative ability to him briefly mentioned the Yuan family and did not mention them again. In the sect, Yuan family was also a taboo word. It's been a year. It's about time for you to go back. He Zhanghai gathered his power and approached the divine light again. Shenguang saw He Zhanghai's expression and reaction just now. He roughly knew that He Zhanghai didn't interact with the Yuan family members and was not very interested in him. Shenguang's strength was beyond He Zhanghai's expectations. He used his own cultivation to pass through the door of the contract and came to this world where he couldn't recover his own ability for as long as a year. However, he had already stayed for a year. It was indeed time for him to go back. Shenguang could clearly feel that the aura around He Zhanghai's body had suddenly become stronger. In the past year, every time He Zhanghai was defeated, his strength would increase. It grew exponentially. Until now, his regenerative ability was getting stronger. Even Moya could feel the strong power around He Zhanghai. All this while, she had been protecting Kang Xinmu. Now that she sensed the aura around He Zhanghai's body, she was shocked. Be careful. Moya's beautiful eyes focused. Her slender jade-like hands quickly formed a seal. With her as the center, the seal spread out in all directions. At this moment, the surrounding space was invaded by waves of white light. He Zhanghai's attack was slightly stagnant. Although the stagnation only lasted for a short while, it didn't weaken. It swept toward Shenguang while heading toward Kang Xinmu. Moya had been paying attention to Kang Xinmu. She stood out immediately, wanting to block the attack for Kang Xinmu. However, the moment she approached, the barrier around her shattered inch by inch. Don't. Shenguang saw this and hurriedly shouted. It was undeniable that Mo Ya's ability to remove negative elements was very strong. However, it wasn't enough to block He Zhanghai's attack. The regenerative ability that he had displayed was a genuine inherited power of the Yuan family. The regenerative ability could regenerate all of one's strength and strengthen it by several times. It could be said to be a very strong auxiliary power. Mo Ya was naturally aware of the strength of He Zhanghai's strength. However, she couldn't ignore Kong Xinmu. As soon as Shen Guang said this, he suddenly dashed forward and blocked He Zhanghai's attack personally. However, he also paid a price for this. He Zhanghai sent him back to the Gate of Contract. Being sent back to the Gate of Contract meant that he wouldn't be able to pass through the Gate of Contract for a long time and wouldn't be able to come to this world. He Zhanghai glanced at Mo Ya coldly. He didn't retract his hand gesture. His target was Kong Xinmu. His power was also locked on to Kong Xinmu. Even if Mo Ya blocked in front of him, his attack would still avoid Mo Ya. This space rampart originally had its own rules. However, since a year ago, the rules in the space rampart had been flowing away. Until now, the space rampart was basically not bound by the rules. Without the restrictions of the rules, He Zhanghai's phantom vortex could operate to the maximum. He could control the power to attack whoever he wanted. Even if the attack deviated from its original trajectory, it could still hit the target that he had locked on to. Mo Ya naturally understood the power of He Zhanghai's phantom vortex. Without the rules of the space rampart, it also lost the most crucial power of the space rampart, binding. He would definitely target all of his attacks on Kong Xinmu. Since that was the case, all of his flaws would be exposed. Mo Ya's figure dashed forward. She wanted to attack He Zhanghai and weaken his attack. However, just as she was about to move, the space around her solidified layer by layer, forming a prison that trapped her inside. Mo Ya immediately used a spell to erase the prison's restrictions. She was very fast, and the speed at which the prison solidified was also very fast. After this cycle repeated 3 times, Mo Ya clearly felt that the prison had become even stronger. If she wanted to remove the prison again, she would have to expend a lot of her soul consciousness. Moreover, before she could remove the prison, it would be restored again. "Miss, I'll have to trouble you for now." He Zhanghai glanced at Mo Ya. His attack had already reached the front of Kong Xinmu's barrier. With his current power, the result of facing Kong Xinmu's barrier was that Kong Xinmu's barrier was like a piece of paper. It crumbled in an instant. "I was wondering how capable you were." He Zhanghai laughed coldly. Chapter 57-33. Jiang Xinwu's figure was nowhere to be seen behind the inch-by-inch shattered barrier. Moreover, there was not even a trace of Kong Xinmu's aura. Not only in the barrier, but even around the barrier, including the surrounding space, there was no trace of Kong Xinmu's aura. Suddenly, He Zhanghai seemed to have thought of something. His eyes narrowed, and he looked at Mo Ya. Mo Ya's figure also suddenly disappeared. What the hell was going on? Ever since the rules in the space barrier disappeared, the phantom vortex was no longer affected. It was no exaggeration to say that no one in the cave mansion could escape his perception when they used spatial techniques. However, at this moment, Kong Xinmu had disappeared into thin air. Not only could he not sense any spatial technique Kong Xinmu used, but he also could not sense when Mo Ya had left. He Zhanghai calmed his mind and used the phantom vortex technique. In a year's time, his phantom vortex spell had been refined to the large success stage. In just a breath's time, it spread across the entire space of the cave mansion. He Zhanghai did not let go of any corner. He was determined to find Kong Xinmu and Mo Ya. At this time, in the space not far from He Zhanghai, in front of a stone table in a secret room in the cave mansion, Kong Xinmu put Mo Ya down. "Kong Xinmu?" Moya was a little surprised. When she sensed Kong Shinmu using the technique, she felt that she had passed through layers of space. When the pressure from the space disappeared, she arrived at this place. This secret room was the one where they first found the star map lock. Senior, I have comprehended the supreme spatial force. Kong Shinmu moved his shackles and said with a smile. He had gained a lot from this heavenly tribulation. Not only did his cultivation base improve, but he had also mastered the supreme spatial force. Supreme spatial force? Moya was a little surprised. In a year, Kong Shinmu had comprehended the supreme spatial force. Not only was he talented, but he also had a good comprehension ability. Yes, although I've only comprehended part of it, it's not difficult to deal with the spatial barrier. As he spoke, Kong Shinmu glanced in one direction. That was where He Zhanghai was. He Zhanghai's phantom vortex is also a kind of space-type magic art. I had thought that my supreme spatial energy would not be able to contend against it, but now it seems that it can surpass the range of the phantom vortex's perception. Kong Shinmu pondered over the opposites within. Looking at He Zhanghai's posture, he didn't seem to have noticed his departure. Since that was the case, the realm of this supreme spatial energy was not weak. However, even though he had avoided He Zhanghai's senses, he was still unable to leave this space barrier for a while. There were countless spatial barriers in this cave. Later on, they gathered together, causing some changes to the entire cave. Take this secret room for example. It was originally just a secret room with a star map lock. Due to the changes in the space rampart, the space here also changed and gradually became like a space rampart. On the surface, the space rampart was like a barrier, but in reality, it was a kind of conceptual substance. Just like Gufeng's space division, a cultivator could still divide the space layer by layer even when they were in space. This was because space was a conceptual existence. The same went for space ramparts. They were all conceptual existences. It looked like a thin layer of space rampart, but in reality, its thickness was unimaginable. If he wanted to leave this cave, he would have to pass through layers of space ramparts. He Zhanghai was not far from this secret room, but if he wanted to use the phantom vortex to find this place, he would have to pass through layers of space ramparts to lock onto Kong Shinmu and Moya's traces. Of course, Kong Shinmu knew that he could not leave the cave yet. Moreover, he had to fight He Zhanghai. He had snatched the star map lock, and he had not gotten it back yet. There was one more thing that he could not forget. He Zhanghai coveted Moya, so he must not let him go. Senior, after I comprehended the supreme spatial energy, I realized that there's something strange about this secret room. Kong Shinmu came to the table in the room. The star map lock had originally been placed on this table. At that time, the star map lock had been enveloped by dermic power, and any cultivator would have stopped in their tracks. Kong Shinmu knew that Tang Xiaoyu had helped him obtain the dermic seal, and he had benefited from Tang Xiaoyu's luck. Successfully comprehending the dermic seal was also a kind of opportunity. He had used the dermic seal to break the dermic power on the star map lock, and the star map lock had been snatched away by He Zhanghai. At that time, Kong Shinmu only cared about chasing after the star map lock, but he had neglected the table with the star map lock. This table was also a type of dermic artifact, and it seemed to be a space-type dermic artifact. The cultivator who had moved this cave out had realized that this table was a dermic artifact, so he had moved it out together with Moya. Moya only noticed this table after Kong Shinmu reminded her. She touched the table, and her eyes suddenly lit up. Senior, what's wrong? Kong Shinmu noticed the change in Moya's expression, and he was a little curious. This seems to be a raw material for refining a space-type dermic artifact. Moya was very certain. Keep this first, it will definitely be useful in the future. Senior, you're right, but I don't think I can keep this thing. Kong Shinmu tried, but he could not keep it into his space storage bag. Do you understand what to do next? Moya smiled gently and said. Yes. Kang Shinmu laughed bitterly. He had to get the star map lock back. Speaking of which, he had not been able to contact Ao Tong's puppet ever since he had entered the sealed mystic realm. He had to get the star map lock back as soon as possible. So it's here. At this time, He Zhanghai's phantom whirlpool had finally passed through the layers of space barriers and arrived at this secret room. Although he said it casually, He Zhanghai was very surprised. Kang Shinmu and Moya were so close to each other, but he did not notice them at all. Especially when Kang Shinmu used his sorcery, the surrounding space did not fluctuate at all. As soon as he finished speaking, He Zhanghai's figure swept over. As soon as he arrived, his eyes fell on the stone table that was placed on the side. With just a glance, He Zhanghai noticed that the stone table was different. Without any hesitation, he put the stone table away. Kang Shinmu and Moya were stunned. He Zhanghai put the stone table away. He must have a high-level space-type dermic artifact. I thought you would be able to do something after a year of closed-door cultivation. You're just so. He Zhanghai put the stone table away, and he did not forget to insult Kang Shinmu. It's good that you put it away. Saves me the trouble, Kang Shinmu said with a straight face. He Zhanghai was infuriated. He didn't say a word and directly attacked. The aura that leaked out from his body directly blew up the entire secret room. Even the surrounding secret rooms were not spared. The aura was so majestic that even the surrounding space was shattered. Chapter 57-34. The cultivators who came here were all aiming for the Star Atlas lock. Due to the existence of the magic force, they were unable to obtain the Star Atlas lock for a while, so they all set out to find a way to break the magic force. Of course, the disciples of the four sects were all aware of the existence of the seal. After knowing about the existence of the magic force, they focused on finding the seal. The only way to break the magic force on the Star Atlas lock was to find the core of the Star Atlas lock, which was the seal. A year had passed, but no one had found the seal. At some point in time, a clue regarding the traces of the Dharma seal was revealed. It was said that the people from the Wuxia pavilion had obtained the seal and broken the magic force. Now, they were going to take the Star Atlas lock. Recently, all the cultivators who entered this place rushed into the cave abode and passed through layers of space barriers just to find the Star Atlas lock. He Zhanghai released his power at this time. In the eyes of other cultivators, they only thought that a certain powerhouse had come to fight for the Star Atlas lock. However, there were some powerhouses who accurately determined He Zhanghai's identity based on his unique aura the moment he released his power. Hence, they all rushed here. The four sects, as the representatives of the powerhouses in the outer region, also played a leading role. Indeed, when everyone saw the people from the four sects heading to the secret room of the cave abode, they followed their footsteps one after another. Although it was impossible to snatch the Star Atlas lock from the hands of the people from the four sects, following them to see the world might be able to gain some benefits. Among the mixed crowd, there was no lack of the existence of extremely powerful powerhouses. For example, Songyu. Songyu had actually sensed the aura leaked when He Zhanghai and Shengguang fought a long time ago. It was one thing to sense it, but it was really difficult to find the place of the fight. Moreover, Songyu knew He Zhanghai and knew his identity, so she did not intend to have anything to do with He Zhanghai. Recently, she heard that the people from the Wuxia pavilion obtained the seal, broke the magic force, and took the Star Atlas lock. Currently, there was only He Zhanghai from the Wuxia pavilion here, so it was certain that He Zhanghai must have taken the Star Atlas lock. There were many people who had the same idea as Songyu, but no one wanted to stand out. They all wanted to be the fishermen who took advantage of the situation. Thus, the cultivators who came here first all stayed in one place and observed the situation. The people of the four major sects, including those from the Wuji Pavilion, arrived one after another. With He Zhanghai making such a scene, Kang Xinmu also had a premonition of what would happen next. When he brought Moya to this place, he had already circulated the supreme power of space. The supreme spatial energy contained the characteristics of the supreme sacred ice domain, and it could create a new space out of thin air. Although the created space was not suitable for cultivators or other living creatures, it was enough to deal with He Zhanghai. When He Zhanghai appeared, he didn't know that he had already entered the control of Kang Xinmu's supreme spatial force. When He Zhanghai used the illusory vortex again, he finally realized this. Power of space? He Zhanghai still thought that it was just an ordinary power of space, and he didn't think that Kang Xinmu had comprehended the supreme spatial energy. It wasn't that he hadn't fought with Kang Xinmu before, so he was no stranger to the supreme divine power that Kang Xinmu possessed. Kang Xinmu wasn't an ordinary cultivator with twin supreme divine power, but he possessed several types of supreme divine power. For example, the power of the supreme holy land, the supreme soul power, and the evolved power of the supreme divine fire were displayed earlier. Vaguely, there seemed to be a type of supreme divine power. Every supreme cultivator would be able to comprehend the supreme divine power corresponding to their talent power. Before that, they had to step into the supreme divine power. In other words, they had to devour a type of supreme divine power and comprehend the corresponding supreme divine power. At this point, it was basically set. The cultivator had to cultivate the supreme divine power and reach the peak of the supreme divine power. It was also the so-called 9th level of the supreme divine power realm. And the supreme divine power level 9 cultivators would sense the rules corresponding to their talent, and once they stepped into the gate of rules, they would reach the realm of rules. He Zhanghai was in this state now. The supreme divine power level 9 realm. He could clearly sense the situation of Kang Xinmu's supreme divine power. Because of this, his view of Kang Xinmu had changed. He always thought that Kang Xinmu was just lucky, but he didn't expect that Kang Xinmu possessed several types of supreme divine power. Without a strong enough comprehension ability and a strong soul consciousness, it was impossible to control so many supreme divine power at the same time. With Kang Xinmu's strong comprehension ability, it was naturally very normal for him to have a type of power of space. When they really fought, He Zhanghai realized that the space around him wasn't as simple as he thought. Also, Kang Xinmu's supreme divine power seemed strange. No matter what kind of power of space it was, He Zhanghai sealed the surrounding space. To Kang Xinmu, what He Zhanghai was doing now was just the surface strength. After a year's time, his supreme divine power had improved, especially his supreme god spiritual flame, which had been greatly strengthened. Originally, his supreme god spiritual flame had already reached the 8th level. The reason why it was so hard to break through to the 9th level was because some changes had occurred. After this closed-door cultivation, it had reached the 9th level. The strength of the 9th level Supreme God Spiritual Flame far surpassed He Zhanghai's 9th level Supreme Divine Power. Also, at the same time, Kang Xinmu's other Supreme Divine Powers had also greatly strengthened. The only thing that didn't change was probably the Supreme Divine Power of the Soul. It seemed that the advancement of the Supreme Divine Power of the Soul was inextricably linked to the soul consciousness. Kang Xinmu's soul consciousness was many times stronger than cultivators of the same level. Because his soul consciousness was very strong, it was very difficult for him to continue cultivating. This also caused his Supreme Divine Power of the Soul to be unable to improve. Fortunately, he had comprehended the power of space. The strengthening of the soul consciousness, other than the continuous strengthening of one's own cultivation, also needed to be tempered. Only in this way, the strength of the soul consciousness would be strengthened in a practical sense. Of course, there was the possibility that there were some special cultivation methods for the soul consciousness. Supreme cultivators couldn't blindly cultivate this kind of mental cultivation method. Otherwise, it would interfere with the understanding of the supreme domain power. Also, one couldn't be too hasty in cultivation. Being too hasty would often result in irreversible consequences. In short, it was extremely easy for the current Kong Xinmu to deal with He Zhonghai. Especially with the power of space in hand, it was very difficult for He Zhonghai to touch him. Instead, He Zhonghai used the illusory vortex technique to trap himself in space. Supreme Divine Power Level 9 Realm. Chapter 57-35. In a year's time, Kong Xinmu's supreme divine power had reached such a terrifying level. The realm of supreme divine power level 8 was an existence that was difficult to surpass for cultivators below the realm of level 8. It was not an exaggeration to say that a cultivator who had reached the 8th level of supreme divine power could easily crush any cultivator below the 8th level. And there was an insurmountable gap between the 8th and the 9th level of the supreme divine power realm. Just like breaking through to the supreme superior level, not only did it require an extremely strong comprehension, but it also required the absorption of the existing supreme divine power, combined with the cultivator's own talent, to reach the supreme superior level. If there were any mistakes during this process, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. This was the difference between the 8th and 9th level of the supreme divine power realm. The difference was that breaking through to the 9th level did not require the absorption of the corresponding supreme divine power. It all depended on one's own comprehension. Among all this, the most important thing was the supreme territory power. Only the supreme divine power that could unleash the supreme territory power could produce the corresponding rules. It could be said that the 9th level of supreme divine power was preparation for the rules. Kong Xinmu had already comprehended the 9th level. Even though He Zhonghai's supreme divine power had already reached the 9th level, he still believed that Kong Xinmu could not break through to the 9th level in a short period of time. But now, in front of him, Jiang Shenwu had indeed reached the 9th stage. "Isn't it time to return my things?" Kong Xinmu's eyes narrowed as he said in a low voice. "Come and take it if you can." He Zhonghai knew the main purpose of coming to the secret realm. It was not just the everlasting pavilion. The other sects were also here for the star map lock. Even though they had already obtained the star map lock, there was still one more important thing to do before leaving. The kid in front of him, Kong Xinmu, was holding Xiaofan's summoning instrument, Star Devourer. No, it should be the 8-god star plate. He Zhonghai could not help but feel disappointed in Xiaofan. Xiaofan had possessed Star Devourer a long time ago, but the people of Everlasting Pavilion only knew that it was Xiaofan's summoning Dharma artifact. They didn't know that it was the 8-god star disc. No matter what, he had to get the 8-god star plate back. He Zhonghai and Kong Xinmu fought again. Both of their supreme divine powers had reached the 9th level. It was fine if they didn't make a move, but once they did, it was earth-shattering. In the end, the cave couldn't hold on and collapsed. The cave had collapsed, and the entire place was in a mess. However, the spatial barrier that enveloped the entire cave was still there. Even if their attacks broke through the spatial barrier would quickly shift and be repaired. In short, their current attacks were unable to completely break through the spatial barrier. The cultivators who entered the cave abode were completely trapped in the spatial barrier after the cave abode was destroyed. It was also at this time that many cultivators realized the scope of the space barrier. In addition, the battle between Kong Xinmu and He Zhonghai was constantly moving. Broken spatial barriers were everywhere. Some of the spatial barriers could not be repaired in time, and spatial cracks would appear. Although these spatial cracks were connected to the outside world of the cave abode, they were affected by the spatial storm. It was difficult for ordinary cultivators to cross them. The creator of the spatial barrier, Hao Yan, had already sensed what had happened here the moment the cave abode was destroyed. Even though he was in another world, the spells he had left behind still existed. Hao Yan couldn't help but feel surprised. He didn't expect that someone could break through the power of magic on the star map lock. It seemed that this batch of cultivators who entered the mystic realm was not weak. Hao Yan's hand gestures quickly changed a few times, forming a complicated seal. An irregular crystal-like object suddenly appeared in front of him. The moment this object appeared, it slowly rotated. Following Hao Yan's command, this crystal-like object suddenly changed shape. At the same time, the spatial barrier around the cave abode where Kong Xinmu and the others were located suddenly trembled. Then, it changed rapidly. There was no order to the transformation of the spatial barrier. There was no law to its transformation at all. It was completely random. The cave abode that was originally destroyed actually reappeared in the space where the spatial barrier was located. Some cultivators discovered that there was no flow of aura in the newly formed cave abode. In other words, there was no flow of air. It was like a kind of magic tool. There was only the existence of space, no aura. For a moment, all the cultivators in the cave abode were on high alert. On the one hand, they were paying attention to the changes in the cave abode. On the other hand, they were quickly looking for the battle between Kong Xinmu and He Zhanghai. The moment the spatial barrier changed, Kong Xinmu sensed it. Not only did the spatial barrier repair itself, but the laws within it were also restored. Before comprehending the supreme power of space, Kong Xinmu only knew that there were laws in the spatial barrier, but he didn't know what the specific laws were. All the decisions he made were very cautious. Until the devouring power of the 7 devouring demon sealing art was activated. This devouring power didn't matter what kind of laws the other party had. As long as it was a law, it would devour it. It could be said that it was not picky at all. Now, the laws of the spatial barrier appeared again. This time, the laws made Kong Xinmu a little puzzled. He had to use the supreme power. Other than that, no other power could be used. Kong Xinmu was surprised. Was this the power of the supreme power of space? The laws related to space were quickly detected. Compared to Kong Xinmu, He Zhanghai wasn't as sensitive to the laws that appeared in the spatial barrier. He knew that there was a certain law, but he didn't know what kind of law it was. For this reason, He Zhanghai released the 2 powers, the formation vortex and the phantom vortex, at the same time, in an attempt to identify the laws within. Both were not supreme power. Without a doubt, He Zhanghai was attacked by the laws in the spatial barrier. The consequence of violating the laws was to be punished by the lightning tribulation of judgment. 2 lightning tribulation of judgment came crashing down and woke He Zhanghai up. He quickly put away the 2 secret techniques. As he wasn't sure what the laws were, He Zhanghai chose to wait and see. However, Kong Xinmu wouldn't wait for him to determine what the new laws were. While He Zhanghai couldn't act rashly, he quickly defeated He Zhanghai, took back the star map lock, and left with Emoya. Brat, He Zhanghai gritted his teeth, wishing he could tear Kong Xinmu to pieces. Only after Kong Xinmu and Emoya left did He Zhanghai understand what the new laws in the spatial barrier were. He Zhanghai retracted all of his power and circulated the supreme power of wind, speeding in the direction where Kong Xinmu and Emoya left. Chapter 57-36. Supreme wind power could allow one to fly in the air, which was comparable to any movement technique. Given He Zhanghai's current supreme wind power realm, he could completely replace the phantom vortex technique. For now, for He Zhanghai, it was equivalent to not being able to use the position vortex. This was what He Zhanghai was proud of, and he was certain that he could rely on it to defeat Kong Xinmu and obtain the 8-god astrolabe and the Star Atlas lock. Of course, there was also the Star Atlas lock that Kong Xinmu possessed. Most people didn't know what the Star Atlas lock was, but he clearly knew that it was a seal of space. Kong Xinmu didn't deserve the power of the seal. He Zhanghai did not know that Jiang Shenwu had already grasped the power of the seal. Moreover, he had used the power of the seal that he had grasped, as well as the power that the seal itself exerted on Jiang Shenwu, to break through the power of the seal that existed on the Star Atlas lock. In other words, the seal had already recognized Kang Shinmu. In addition, Kang Shinmu had already comprehended the power of space, and the Star Atlas lock happened to be a seal of space, so the seal had completely become Kang Shinmu's power. Once the seal was completely comprehended by Kang Shinmu, it would form the laws of space. At that time, everything within the space that Kang Shinmu planned would be bound by the laws of space that Kang Shinmu had created. Before Kang Shinmu stepped into the gate of rules, the seal only existed in the form of the laws of space. This law was that no techniques related to space could be used. Kang Shinmu himself wouldn't be affected at all. This power, combined with the supreme power of space, could release an even stronger power. Kang Shinmu knew that he couldn't delay any longer, so he decisively released the power of space. At the same time, he released the power of the seal. At his current level, he could already skillfully combine the two without suffering any backlash from the power. The realm of the supreme spatial force was not high. It could only serve as a restriction. What was truly needed to be used in battle was the supreme divine flame. If the power of a 9th stage supreme divine flame were to face He Zhanghai's 9th stage supreme wind force or supreme lightning force, it might not necessarily be a match. He Zhanghai was also aware of this point. He knew that Kang Shinmu possessed multiple types of unparalleled god powers. It was just that he did not cultivate them to perfection. For example, the unparalleled soul power was only at the 4th level. Even though the unparalleled soul power was special and could directly corrode a cultivator's soul consciousness, the unparalleled soul force was still unique. However, the supreme soul power of the 4th stage couldn't cause any big waves. The only 9th level supreme power was the power of the supreme divine fire. Since the beginning of the fight, He Zhanghai had more or less figured out the strangeness of Kang Shinmu's supreme divine fire power. It was different from the power of ordinary supreme divine flames. There was an elemental aura mixed within it, and it was very similar to the flames of dead spirits. However, the addition of a portion of the flames of dead spirits was not enough to pose any threat. He Zhanghai had already released the peerless power of wind and lightning. These two types of unparalleled god powers had both reached the 9th level. Although he could not use other secret techniques, he could use these two types of unparalleled god powers to create laws. Using these laws to deal with Kang Shinmu was an extremely easy task. Most importantly, he had the power of regeneration. Although the power of regeneration was not an orthodox supreme power, after He Zhanghai's cultivation, it was close to being a supreme power. He Zhanghai released the power of regeneration and did not suffer any backlash from the laws. It was obvious that the laws had already regarded the power of regeneration as a supreme power. The moment He Zhanghai released the power of regeneration, Kang Shinmu had already gathered the supreme divine flame. At the same time, he sensed the existence of the power of regeneration. Moreover, with his supreme spatial force, he could see the minute particles that existed around He Zhanghai. These particles were like the power of nature that existed in the natural world, and they floated around He Zhanghai's body. When He Zhanghai released the power of wind and supreme lightning, the particles floating around him would automatically move closer to his body. The power that was consumed would be restored in an extremely short period of time. The power of regeneration? A year ago, when He Zhanghai fought with the divine light, he used the power of regeneration to forcefully beat the divine light back to the other world. A year later, He Zhanghai once again used the power of regeneration. When Kang Shinmu realized the existence of this power, he suddenly had an idea. On the surface, there was a huge disparity between Kang Shinmu and He Zhanghai's battle strength. Kang Shinmu had no chance of winning. However, this was only on the surface. Supreme Divine Flame was the advanced form of the flames of dead spirits. The 9th level Supreme Divine Flame was the advanced form of the flames of dead spirits. It was enough to suppress the Supreme Wind and Supreme Lightning at the same level. Kang Xinmu used the power of space and released the power of the Supreme Divine Flame without holding back. The moment the Supreme Divine Flame swallowed He Zhanghai's body, He Zhanghai still felt that his 2 supreme powers could withstand the Supreme Divine Flame. Even if they couldn't withstand it, the power of regeneration could help him recover quickly. However, the reality was cruel. When the unparalleled God Spirit Flame struck He Zhanghai, the unparalleled wind force and unparalleled lightning force were instantly destroyed. The power of devouring, which had been refined by the 7 devouring demon sealing art, swept out in an instant, swallowing the supreme wind and supreme lightning. After devouring these 2 supreme powers, the connection between Kang Xinmu and the power of magic became even closer. This also confirmed his guess. He needed all of his supreme powers to reach the 9th level before he could step into the door of rules. Moreover, all of his supreme powers referred to not only the supreme powers he already possessed, but also the new supreme powers he obtained. He Zhanghai, who had lost his supreme powers, was on the verge of death when the power of regeneration came into effect. Kang Xinmu had been waiting for the power of regeneration. When the power of regeneration was activated, the power of devouring instantly swept over, wrapping him up and quickly swallowing him. He Zhanghai, who had lost his power of regeneration, could not resist any force at all and collapsed in this broken space. The battle between Kang Xinmu and He Zhanghai ended. The restrictions on the space were also lifted. Senior Emoya, let's leave this place quickly. Kang Xinmu did not intend to stay here any longer. Not long ago, he had sensed Dan Yuanfei's aura. Up until now, he had not fought with Dan Yuanfei, so he was not sure how strong Dan Yuanfei was. However, he knew that this was not a place to stay for long. Kang Xinmu used the power of space to quickly leave the cave with Emoya. The moment the 2 of them left the cave, the layers of space around the cave suddenly disappeared. The cave was exposed to the ordinary space.